I see a silhouette. It seems like a familiar figure, perhaps even a person. It moves smoothly but too quickly. This both fits into a coherent picture and somehow resists within me. It's Marderface. He and I have been stuck here for over a week. What used to be our camp now looks more like the remnants of the Dyatlov expedition. The tent is torn from the inside and all our belongings are scattered around at varying distances, as if by an explosion. The image of Marderface churns my stomach because I still see two beings in him. The first is his physical shell, and the second is whatever caused all the terror and intense emotions yesterday. Marderface is my classmate and friend, by the way. He's a little shorter than me, with a head that seems slightly sunken into his shoulders, as if he spent his whole life ducking from something. But it's not the stern image of a parent or a monotonous teacher pointing out mistakes that's to blame here. His threat was the sky or existence itself. It loomed as a giant, manifesting through countless meanings daily in his mind. In him, there was a constant, frozen questioning, as if reflected in his hunching posture, and the most intriguing part was catching the moment when he might straighten his neck. But that moment never came. He always lived in that split second in the middle, knowing that moving in either direction would change everything forever, and there'd be no going back. There was no going back from what we had brought to life. Our seemingly harmless explorations stemmed from deep psychological issues. His list of problems rolled like the pleasant crackle of papyrus down the staircase to the underworld, leaving behind the right to dream about its inevitable, and surely it had to end someday, right? My own list could be compared to a person who had fallen asleep on a keyboard while working on a text document, their single exaggerated facial feature pinning down a row of keys, sending a random combination of letters into an endless digital void. That's how we met. Friendship became a symbiosis of acceptance and rejection of essentia moment, white-hot with intensity, a brief instance of playing the electric guitar. The clash of my horrific riff, grave and gnawing into the guitar neck in a desperate hope for resurrection from the dead, and escape from the frozen inability to move along the frets. Pointless noise extraction, disintegration into the cacophony of amplifier sounds consumed by high voltage and the walls. Unlike me, Marderface could actually play the guitar, and his melody entered this world like an ancient demon, whirling like a mad dervish in a peeling old apartment where we rehearsed. This dance was so beautiful and raw that in rare moments of descending clarity, overcome by a strange call, I would bite one end of the cable while plugging the other into the guitar, quietly trying to play in my unique way. It had no real physical effect, but struck the universe in its heart. Within moments, millions of small dancing sparks with the metallic taste of the wire coursed through my veins, mixing with psychedelics and bursts of placebo electricity. Waves of static that made the electronics in passing cars falter. My two metal fillings, one on the upper teeth and the other on the lower, became poles, contacts. As soon as I clenched my jaw even slightly, my brain acted like a receiver, picking up signals from the depths of hell. Marderface played smooth transitions, from which something guided by darkness strove for the light, wanting to destroy itself forever. A moment of a flash illuminated the room, leaving atomic shadows on the walls, and as the neighbor's noise returned, so did mundane reality. Friendship, which came in the form of a rain of chemicals and a series of coincidences, was followed by a quiet but unfriendly fate. Marderface's transfer to our school was a blind spot in my memory, a bloody mishmash of fragments from old books about a futuristic future. It felt as though a quiet, unsettling song played back then, and clean pedestrians were stained by the filth splashed by passing cars. On Marderface's first day at our school, I had just returned from donating blood, still mournfully recalling the opiates coursing through the syringe, their color, smell, and presence. In nausea and anticipation, I felt like a doomed fugitive running from my own opium shadow. Sticky school corridors digested me, moving me along the intestines of the building, colliding with other human masses. Their faces were rewound, like songs played in reverse with demonic undertones. A mere second's gaze at them unleashed a ghostly dance, and I fought to keep from vomiting up sterile codeine. These spectral processions could last hours, but that day was free due to gym class. When I met Marderface, I was sobering up, caught in a state of furious clarity. We simply shook hands, but the ellipsis of that sacred meeting etched camp tattoo numbers onto our forearms, fateful digits that only an inflamed mind could decipher. The next 6 months dried up like a mop wiping the floor of life, leading up to the May graduation day and photos with diplomas, where we entered the final school grades indifferently. After the last bell, a class-wide party was planned. Every 2 hours, my phone would run out of battery, and I'd sit with the least picky people while the charging cable stripes filled with the seed of energy. The people who took me in could infect you with ailments through wires. The kitchen corners were full of dead victims wrapped in the web of substances, their fading eyes reflecting faint embers of life. So faint that if I wanted to light a cigarette from their soul, I'd have to blow hard, and such ignition would inevitably burn the mind. The strategic stock, wrapped in the web, upon prolonged observation, would come alive, only to fall into an even deeper, sleep utterly doomed because it had gained the will and desire to fight. For myself, I noted that in the future, it would be better not to look into these small abysses, especially surrounded by spiders. While the Matrix's maintenance workers went to work through syringes, leaving their empty shells in the neighboring room, I was accompanied by something like a suicide bomber assembled from rotting limbs. A beautiful woman with decaying legs offering to make love. The embrace of a praying mantis made of necrosis and used syringes. A long speech spiraling endlessly to its beginning, while the phone in a coma catches the saving divisions of the charge. At such moments, in the damp, rotten streaks of the walls, saints and the fallen smiled at me. Behind the wall, completely ordinary swearing could be heard. It sounded like the noise inside a deity digesting human souls. There could be as many as 3 such apartments in a day, symbolically protecting me from misguided journeys where I might end up trapped in the web, waiting to be consumed. In a life like this, the best way to protect yourself is through rituals and consistent, perpetual service. In other words, a unique and personal occultism. I was never in the habit of sharing my innermost thoughts, especially substances, with others. But with Marderface, it was different. On graduation day, I heard a call, as clearly as possible a call that defies explanation no matter how much you try. But it's a call that everyone hears at least once in their life. That May Day could be considered his rite of passage, a kind of birth into substances. After the substances, I shared my beliefs about what I called pharma occultism. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had found myself in another person. As if there were no longer people wandering on desolate outskirts, shells filled with substances, but only 2 hemispheres existed. A thought floating in a void, creating division and unity a world, existing through descriptions so perfectly and continuously rendered that no one doubted it was real. But upon closer inspection, there was no doubt that even those thoughts didn't exist. In a blistering moment, a ketamine-induced bell tolled, changing the world once again beyond recognition. Gentle black and white mountains transformed into chitinous trees, and synthetic insects tirelessly maintaining reality, imbuing the world with authenticity. Marderface sliced through the plasticine of reality with a burning blade stolen from a divine prison, while I pretended to be a flexible stain, capable of appearing the same from every angle. Quick shadows flew by, disgraced by their unremarkable existence and simple, primitive sequences. No matter how reality flared in the fire ignited by ketamine, it all inevitably led to oblivion. After an enormous amount of ketamine, came the phallic-exhausted, miserable days leading nowhere. In those moments, it felt as though sobriety had drained the essence of life, replacing everything that had held even the slightest value. Emerging from intense trip binges was excruciatingly difficult. The pain, like an orthodox bell tolling over the broken hump of eternity, reflected a false, shattered sky. In such a sky, one could wash their hands or pray to forgotten gods who masqueraded as your friends and loved ones. You stare for hours at a life slipping away without exerting any effort. But one of the deepest, and as I thought, primary properties of the shattered sky was its ability to transmit the sound of a soul's pulsating pain. Gradually, these sounds would transform into complex waves, shifting into kaleidoscopic patterns or Rorschach-like stains, before inevitably becoming ephemeral beings wholly absorbed by their striving towards something or somewhere. While observing this, I often caught myself wondering, could their eternity exist without my observation? And with such a question, my attention would leap out of the erected human, becoming a wave, a flash, and a pattern. A hologram, shimmering through all states and forms until, at some point, it flattened into a single, solid form of something contradictory and indescribable. As though made of the 1960s and the chemical formula of a downfall, it all felt more like an absurd thought, just before drifting into the final deep sleep. That sleep that would never end, because it had never begun. I shared these thoughts, crafted from trinkets and seashells, with Marderface, another pharma occult service. Our rituals were born not from books or established practices, but from substances. Because of this, the so-called faith could not exist without the materialization of blood. Consciousness subordinated to the demon of the soul, the emptiness of the question, and the perceptual genocideer daily journey toward purity, striving for purity and cleansing. To serve fully and always, I had to leave my girlfriend and renounce all friends, communicating only with a small handful of people initiated into the mysteries. Thus, these were blows to the present and the past, to which I sacrificed myself. Marderface's case was different. He seemed to reject a potential future. Almost all his time outside of pharma occultism was spent playing the electric guitar and reading books. Occultism entered his life in the shadow of Christianity, which had erected its temples everywhere, blocking the sun and the sky. Pharma, however, was the light that needed no source because it was within. We often asked ourselves how our path differed from the early days of Christianity. At its dawn, it was a handful of fanatics driven by no less dubious apocalyptic visions, fueled by the ancestors of the substances we know today. Essentially, the essence was the same, except for one but. Each time we approached it, we reached a telling dead end. Arguments ran out, and what we expressed through music or art simply layered over already existing past revelations. A new day began with an old question, accompanied by wild fervor, and the feeling that the finish line of this endless race had receded even further beyond the imaginable horizon. I believe it was around then that Marderface wrote the song Fiery Friends. At first glance, the melody and lyrics seemed like an ordinary song, except for its shamanic motif and a significant share of mystical revelation entirely unlike anything we had encountered before. At the moment when my bloody fingers, sore from rapid strikes on the over-tightened strings, began to deliver a faint pleasure, the room filled with light. Nothing like this could have come from ketamine, especially so long after taking it. Marderface was the first to fall to his knees, and I quickly followed, afraid of missing the window opening between realities. On the horizon that appeared, floating in the air, was a fiery deity. a light so intense it was hard to look at for more than a moment. And then that light poured over the entire horizon, shining with 1,000 pulsating flames. Fiery friends, arriving from a frozen moment, from the instant of now. Tears streamed down my face. The only thing I could do was bow my head lower and weep. The feeling that I would never be alone again, that it had all been worth it, because the path was absolutely right, filled my soul. The desire to douse myself in gasoline, set myself ablaze, and become one of these flames teetered on the edge of wanting to inhale it and continue worshipping them. "I have never seen anything more beautiful in my life," said Marderface, his voice trembling with emotion. "Me neither," I quietly replied. The song he had written became, for me, like the coffin lid burst open from the inside. Ahead lay an encounter with the earth and then real life, with its mysterious sun and living people. The abrupt change brought bitterness to my soul on one hand, but on the other, it felt monumental, a genuine sense of chosenness and grandeur. From that point on, every event, no matter how insignificant, became a part of the long journey we were destined to take. Every random encounter, each seemingly trivial person, every mundane inscription on a wall everything held meaning. Ignoring these bare signs was tantamount to spitting on our mission on the search for God and our souls. Any chemical substance lives in a body made up of countless interacting individuals. Together, they form a kind of colossus, a mythical beast existing simultaneously on multiple planes. Each person can be likened to an individual thought appearing from nowhere, filling all visible space and then vanishing just as quickly, leaving an illusory haze, a mix of questions and despair. Other people within this being function as organs or cells, wholly dedicated to their purpose. In opium circles, such people appear as a crooked fancier's smile that is hard to obtain. They embody the remnants of decayed teeth, ready to depart at the slightest pressure. Rarely do opium groups present themselves to the world as the smile of this entity. They are held in the absolute darkness of its mouth. These individuals are closest to being the farthest infinitely removed from everything. Opium acts as the guarantor of all that is worst. The snip of scissors severs the umbilical cord connecting the soul to the higher mother. The warmth that feels so comforting you fail to notice as the lines of life on your palms slowly dry up, replaced by radioactive burns that whisper mournfully at night. Stigmatons, you hear them, they are the only thing you'll ever hear again. This horrifying metaphysical giant was our responsibility to confront. "All we need," I said, running my finger across a printed photo of a heptagram, "is to follow the 7 extremes. 7 elemental substances," Marderface said, pointing to each side of the heptagram. Every substance, every cycle of a substance in people is a born god, a kind of giant composed of the sum of everything happening. Its arms and legs know, its appendages, I continued, sketching something between tentacles and tree branches in the air, can be positioned in very specific ways. And to reach this colossus's soul and steal its secret, Marderface ventured. "Yes, it's secret. It's like to steal what we feel but cannot explain." "It won't be easy," said Marderface. "But how do we ensure these metaphysical giants don't crush us first? We need to temporarily become part of its being, an integral part of its organism, so that its system recognizes us as useful cells. Only then do we become a virus, infiltrating its essence, bypassing all distractions until the goal is achieved." A brief pause followed this wave of inspiration, resembling more a breath before decisive thoughts than a silence. "We should start with something omnipresent, something we see on every corner." "Opium?" Marderface suggested. After outlining our plan of action, we returned to the opium colossus, stretching across thousands of kilometers into the past, future, and present. Meeting its head was nothing like discovering an enigmatic continent. its appearance distorted by murky water resembled distant mountains, reflected in the restless churn of an upset stomach. We inched closer to it over the following weeks. Those teeth, warped remnants of former humans, occasionally appeared like rare stakes along our path. Other spaces, unable to bear emptiness, were replaced by silver and golden doppelgangers, cruising in expensive cars. The collective organism felt nothing for them, and while observing them, we discerned certain patterns, including ourselves. In attempting to convey their hidden meaning to Marderface, amidst the omnipresent subjugation to the laws of this collective being, I vomited turbid, codeine-laced water. Fleeting moments of pure days were filled with the smooth haze of the opium environment. The world had irreversibly changed, which meant we had seamlessly become part of this God. From that time onward, I began having the same recurring dream, following a consistent theme. A small, cozy apartment, dimly lit by a bulb in a greasy lampshade. The room where the dream begins resembles a living room, but bears all the signs of a bedroom. A made-up sofa, clothes neatly hanging on a chair, traces of everyday life on the table. Ahead lies a window close to another room or bedroom, stark and lifeless, as if something bad had happened there. The surrounding space both oppresses and provides a sense of psychological safety. The old wallpaper, with its pleasant cream color and faint pattern, evokes memories. A cabinet and dresser in the corner. Everything familiar, yet reminiscent of an old film, an unmistakable echo of the 1970s. The Soviet Union seems present in this frozen life. There's no sense of life moving forward. The world resembles the reality of an unnecessary, forgotten photograph, curling like an autumn leaf under time's pressure, fading and disintegrating. Even the bustling noise outside cars, shouts, and tram vibrations fails to fill the void I feel in this dream. Over time, the dream repeated endlessly. Sometimes I thought my entire life, the one I considered reality, was just a nonsensical dream. Recognizing myself once again in the chambers of that apartment, I'd muse for a while on the absurdity of the previous vision, then freeze in familiar terror before the closed bedroom door. Eventually, I asked Marderface to create a cleansing ritual to end it once and for all. "It seems to me," said Marderface, "that instead of a cleansing ritual, you should break into that room and see what's inside. Maybe that's the anchor holding you back." We took some methadone and walked along railroad tracks, stretching into identical green landscapes of wilderness. "But," Marderface continued, "maybe the right step is to immerse you in an opium-induced lucid dream, where you're guided not by the events themselves, but by opium's will. That way, you won't use your own and might not wake up right away." He paused briefly, stopped, and picked up a piece of locomotive sulfur. Twisting it between his fingers, he confidently resumed, "That's what we'll do. I'll guide you in this dream. There's a similar technique used by psychologists or psychiatrists. All you'll need to do is follow my voice and describe what you see." His words instilled in me a sense of confidence and a kind of festive anticipation. As we continued walking, the images in my mind of what lay behind that door began to unfold with dizzying speed. Most had a psychedelic and eerie undertone, which, though seemingly unimportant at first glance, undoubtedly concealed something profound. Perhaps they were the most significant truths of my life, encoded even for myself. Behind us, a long coal train rumbled toward the heart of the country, and we switched tracks, veering sharply toward the city's outskirts. Each of us was absorbed in our own thoughts, but since recently we had become part of something greater, God we were planning to rob soon. After several hours, we emerged into the city. In the evening, we usually mingled with small groups, observing people. The day's heat had given way to a pleasant coolness. While Marderface conversed with two acquaintances nearby, a girl I had spent most of the summer with sat down beside me. She wanted attention and conversation, and even thinking about it filled me with a sense of futility. thoughts of giving attention to anything other than substances drained my will to live. The alcohol she had drunk glowed with passion in her cheeks, and a single glance was enough to make me nauseous. Her attempts at kisses, the writhing of earthworms beneath the skin of her lips that morphed them into primitive nuclear missiles aimed at my face, her scorching touches so precise they seemed evolutionarily fine-tuned, all revolved around the idea of reproduction, manifesting itself under any circumstances. I could only become lifeless, freeze like a salvation-bound mannequin, and wait for her to grow tired. Someday, she would give up and switch to someone more pliable. Conversations didn't work either. I was so bored I had to summon inhuman effort just to keep from falling asleep. All the topics inevitably revolved around plans for the future. And instead of her farewells and embraces, I plummeted into the velvety chasm of methadone, another group of acquaintances that Marderface and I would never return to again. In recent days, all that was left was to find time for the opium lucid dream session. All our substance experiments usually took place in the derelict apartment where we held our rehearsals. Given the sanctity of the space, we decided to hold the session there as well. Initially, after taking methadone, we wandered aimlessly around the darkened apartment, searching for something undefined. Instead of a lucid opium dream session, I ended up having the most ordinary dream, which culminated in a torrent of vomit. After cleaning up, smoking, and recovering, the whole idea receded to the background. That evening, lying in bed, my mind slowly drifted back to the dreamlike apartment. Realizing this, I armed myself with my dream journal. This time, although the dream flew by quickly, the sense of anxiety I experienced within it lingered even after waking. The anxiety had always been there, but it usually dissipated with the dream. That morning, it felt as though something bad was inevitably going to happen. So, at my request, we decided to attempt the lucid opium dream session again that very day. Marderface abstained from taking anything so he could control the process and avoid falling asleep himself. Initially, we didn't know how to enter the specific dream we were aiming for or how to recreate that particular apartment. We needed something to firmly connect me to that recurring space, so we soon decided to focus on a sense of longing. "What do you see?" Marderface asked. Closing my eyes and relaxing under the influence of methadone, I immediately began visualizing the apartment in vivid detail. "I see the unfolded sofa," I murmured in a calm voice. "It feels like morning. The sofa is unmade. It's very bright outside, and I can't see anything through the window." "Can you go over and look out?" Marderface asked. "No, I don't think I can do anything voluntarily in this place." "All right. Do you see that door?" His voice, clear just a moment ago, now sounded muffled. "Yes, I see it. As soon as I look at it, I feel incredibly uneasy." The very sight of the door sent a wave of fear crashing over me, and I opened my eyes, instantly finding myself back in the room with Marderface. "Well, I don't know. It's just too creepy, too real. For a moment I thought I couldn't hear your voice anymore." "What's so creepy? The way it looks?" "No, it's the feeling I get when I look at it. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff. There's something there irreversible and terrifying, and just looking at it is enough to feel it." "Let's try again," he said. "But this time, try to look around as much as possible and remember every detail." When I started to picture the room again, my vision immediately locked onto the far corner. The overwhelming sense of dread replaced all other emotions, and I opened my eyes again. "No, it throws me out. I can't. We need to figure something out. You need to ground yourself in something from our world. Here, take the electric guitar." Marderface handed me my guitar, which had been lying around, waiting for rehearsals that had become increasingly rare due to our constant farmer occultism sessions. "All right, if it becomes unbearable, Try channeling those feelings into the guitar. Imagine yourself as a conductor, grounded through it. Relaxing once more, I tried to feel the space again. The vision of the frozen room reappeared, the white daylight streaming through the window, the sense of lost time, the unfolded sofa. This time, the light outside was softer, as if the sun had moved behind clouds. For several moments, it felt like dipping into cold water. My consciousness shifted in small bursts. Each new detail first appeared indistinct, part of the broader scene, like a painted canvas. What I had thought was a corner with a cabinet turned out to be a shelf holding a curved television. On the table, there was a vase with dried flowers and a glass bowl filled with bagels and candy. My attention began drifting toward the kitchen through the narrow corridor. Fear pricked at me again as I neared the kitchen, where two closed doors stood in front of me. One door bore a small plaque with a cartoon bunny standing under a shower. Seeing this door triggered the same surge of fear as the closed bedroom door. My efforts to ground myself with the guitar bordered on the feeling of holding my breath too longers, though my consciousness might quietly flicker out at any moment. Yet the experience didn't end, and I pressed on. The kitchen was bathed in bright light, making it impossible to discern anything at first. Then, the light softened, and I could make out every detail. On the worn table, a cup of tea was steaming. Looking closer, I saw a cigarette-tight smoke curling out of a jar filled with cigarette butts beside it. The tea had developed a cold film on its surface. The scene froze in the kitchen, the stillness so profound that I could see every crack in the tiled floor. "What do you see?" asked Marderface. "Right now, it looks like a kitchen. I think I'm sitting in it. There's a jar with cigarette butts nearby. I can see every detail, every scratch on the table, every speck of dust on the floor. It feels incredibly realistic. Almost impossible to distinguish from reality. Honestly, it's the most lifelike thing I've ever seen," I replied. Indeed, what I saw was so indistinguishable from the real world that, if I lingered for just a moment longer on the details of the room, the world where I was sitting, clutching my electric guitar, would start to dissolve, leaving a faint sense of fear. This, in turn, made me grip the guitar even tighter, while the dreamlike world became increasingly illusory. Were it not for my unease about the closed doors, I might have been tempted to let go of everything and see what would happen. But this scenario was different, forcing me to hold on to my consciousness as tightly as possible. On the windowsill sat a radio, and as soon as I focused on it, it began to play a soft melody. The radio just started playing. I can't make out the brand, the logo is too faint. "I don't see a frequency dial," I said. "What song is it? Can you play it for me? Even just roughly, and I'll pick it up," Marderface said, his voice fading slightly as he moved to grab his guitar. My attempts to play the tune met with a peculiar obstacle. As soon as I focused on the frets and my fingers, the dreamlike world started to fade. Conversely, the more I concentrated on the melody, the less I could feel the strings under my fingers. After a few moments of bouncing my attention between these two realities, the melody began to emerge in fragmented bursts. It was as if the radio was spilling out of me, not as sound, but as something tangible. Marderface indicated that he had memorized the melody, and we continued to navigate the frozen landscape of my dream. "Keep talking, describe everything you see," he urged. "There's a tiled wall, blue, laid out in a diamond pattern. To my right is a window with curtains pinned in the corners with small nails. The windows are still taped shut from the winter, except for the vent pane. On the sill, there's a flower and the radio. Oh, and on the tiles in one spot, there are stickers, like the ones they put on bananas. Small ones, a few scattered here and there. The brand name is in some kind of script, maybe Chinese. There's a table here with a cup of tea and the jar of cigarette butts, and a pack of cigarettes too also with some kind of characters. None of the names are familiar. Can you turn your head to look behind you?" "Not exactly, but I can still see it. There's kitchen furniture and a fridge. The brand says Donbass. Huh, interesting. But I can't open it, just like I can't open any of the cupboards. I don't control my movements here. Wait, something's happening. I'm walking down the corridor now, toward the bathroom. The door is opening. I suddenly open my eyes. I think he saw me. What? Who saw you? Asked Marderface, smirking nervously. The person this is happening to. He opened the bathroom, and I saw myself, or rather, him in the mirror. His eyes. That look. No one looks at themselves like that. He was looking at me. He saw me inside of him. I'm sure of it. Wait a second. You need to exit this session properly. You need to close the entrance you came through. How? I didn't enter anywhere it all started from the usual point. The view of the living room, the couch, and the closed door, that's it. You need to close the entry point. When you see that place again, you need to understand that you're not really there. It's just an illusion, a dream. Remember yourself sitting in this chair, with me here, in this apartment, and everything will fade on its own. The piercing fear electrified my senses. My hair stood on end, and an uncomfortable itch crept over my body, like a real bad trip under opiates. It was something utterly out of the ordinary. One could say 1,000 times that it felt too real. But even that wouldn't capture the terror I felt when locking eyes with the figure in the dream. There were no distinct features, no memorable face, just eyes gleaming with piercing, frenzied madness, emerging from a foggy visage with a demonic glare. It was as though that gaze was speaking directly to me. Hey, I see you, I see you, I see you! Another thought of that gaze sent a cold, crawling fear down my neck, through my stomach, and into my legs. The terror was so intense that I tried with all my might not to close my eyes, lest I accidentally meet him again. Marderface lit a cigarette and opened the window. As I struggled to calm down and shake off the paralysis, he started lightly strumming the melody from the dream radio on his unplugged electric guitar. At first, he played it in its original rhythm, then slowed it down. The slowed down version transformed the tune into something eerily haunting, its funeral-like rhythm sending chills down my spine. Then, something happened that made me crawl to the floor and try to hide from everything around me. The lifeless voice of the dreamlike figure, frozen in front of the mirror, began to hum words that echoed inside my head. The words sent shivers through me, leaving me trembling and on the brink of fainting. Let us praise the name in the gravestone. What even the devil dares not proclaim. Try to leave as you have before, but attempts too many won't earn you the door. Return once again, you'll return yet again. For what awaits on the grave, marked in sin, you'll return to behold once again. Out of sheer terror, I began repeating everything to Marderface, over and over, until I collapsed into convulsions on the floor. My entire body was struck by a surge of electricity, and some unseen force dragged me while my convulsions resisted. Gradually, my consciousness started returning. He's singing, there! He hears everything! I screamed in horror. Close it, quickly. When I closed my eyes, he was there again, staring with his crazed eyes into the mirror. It was then that I noticed what was inside the bathroom. Blood, unrealistically bright, was everywhere, the tiles on the walls, the entire floor, even part of the mirror. A second later, my attention caught sight of the bathtub to the left. From the thick, crimson mass, pale limbs protruded like island-spiraled arms and legs, lying on top of a half-submerged, blood-covered torso. And then, his gaze again questioning, mocking, filled with a sense of absolute boundless power. No, you're not real. This is just a dream. I'm in the apartment with Marderface. There's a view of the bus station outside the window. It's early June. This is just my dream. It's not real. What's real is the apartment I'm in right now. And indeed, the blood-soaked bathroom started to brighten, becoming dazzlingly white until my eyes finally opened. Phew, this has to be the worst bad trip of my life, I said, fully regaining consciousness and getting up off the floor. The vividness of the experience lingered like fresh paint, and recounting what I had seen took effort, as I fought not to slip back into that phantom yet disturbingly alive room of my memory. Marderface, following his usual habit, jotted some notes in his songwriting notebook, meticulously recording every word of that horrifying song I had unconsciously been singing. Man, I think I'd rather stick to psychedelics and dissociatives than opiates. One wrong step, and you might actually end up like that, he said as he prepared to leave. Being alone felt unsettling, especially after such a harrowing experience. The methadone's effects had completely worn off, leaving only the occasional pang of nausea. I downed a bit more codeine, and we parted ways, each of us carrying the unsettling aftertaste of the day's events. Back home, my thoughts raced chaotically, only to be herded into order by the numbing effect of the codeine. Reflecting on the day, recalling bits and pieces of what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary pharmacult experience. The whole thing felt far too mundane. Its setting was ordinary and familiar, not the typical demonic apocalyptic revelations we'd come to expect. That was what made it so unnerving. The ordinariness of it all was too familiar, too close to something you might stumble upon in real life. Though my state shifted into the serene plateau of codeine, my mind kept replaying images from the dream. The bloody bathroom, the pale limbs, and those wild, maniacal eyes. Soon, only the eyes remained a vivid recollection of their intense gaze. Over and over, I tried to associate that stare with other mad eyes I'd encountered in life. Even the crazed, sleepless eyes of tweaked-out junkies couldn't compare. I remembered a local chatterbox, a man who, in the throes of a deranged binge, had boiled his gangrenous leg. His crazed laughter, watching the frothy stains form in a pot with the visibly bleached limb, came to mind. But even the moment when his eyes reflected the sight of steaming, peeling flesh couldn't rival the sheer madness of the eyes from my dream. Such a strange rhythm of thoughts plunged me into a dream filled with ragged, starving people. Surprisingly, nothing related to the apartment or the horrors of the previous day appeared, and I mistakenly thought that it had all passed. A month went by, and July arrived, bringing with it heat and long, sleepless nights. Marderface shared revelations about the second extremity of the heptagram, while I strummed sparse melodies, coming to my fingers in awkward spasms. It took effort to follow the thread of his thoughts. Over the past month, nothing significant had happened, but my attitude toward pharmacultism changed drastically. More accurately, my approach to it shifted. That experience with lucid opium dreams had grounded me. There was nothing left to do but rely on what was tangible, though Marderface still held firm faith in the 7 extremities. The heptagram, still present in the apartment, had gained its perfect copy, a massive one now displayed across the entire wall. Over recent weeks, as we sought refuge from the heat, we would gaze at this unfinished concept that loomed over us like a solemn warning. As the last remnants of sobriety seeped from me along with my sweat, Marderface began to muse aloud. This silence is torture. I want to see them blinded by the darkness, transformed into mutants. All I need is one perfect jump, one precise strike. We were so close to the goal. Our work is brilliant, dying and turning into nothing. That's what they want. Is that victory? Number step by step, until blood spills from your ass. And then, I need to mark the site of victory, right here. Let it serve as a map, not for a journey, but for action. And then the rain will begin, eternity pouring light upon us, so that someone might ask, what time is it now? Maybe this is the best time to lose or to offer the finest defeat. The butchers will take Mimi's choice is to cut the choice. That is my choice. To cut the choice. Cut the choice. Cut the choice. Cut the choice. As he repeated, choice, He grabbed the electric guitar and began playing heavy riffs on its slack strings, filling his words with primordial power. It was equally hard for me to follow this ritual of free reflection, and I began to sink into chaotic, vivid experiences. Outside the window lay a deserted bus station, the blazing sun wielding all possible reflections, directing its beams like weapons at my throbbing temples. A Wild West-style heist with helpless hostages, of which I was one unfolded in my mind. The scorching air slithered along my body like snakes, searching for a way into the room before swirling to fill it completely. Amid this oppressive setting, the shadow of the window's ledge felt like a deserved medal, belonging solely to me in this world. Even the rare hum of passing cars could not compete with the overwhelming heat. The diazepam did its job, and every blink drained a part of me along with the room. Marderface was no longer there, practicing his song's freshly starched, straitjacket-like verses spilling out one by one. They appeared to me like a twisted nursery rhyme, with madmen instead of sheep or numbers. These madmen tore at their straitjackets in fractals, and with every rip of fabric came another figure. Instead of outstretched arms seeking to embrace the world, a new, instant rupture would flash before my eyes. The best solution was to leave them behind, along with their procession, until the song found its final form. It was terrifying to recognize myself as one of these madmen who was so quickly replaced by others. The sweltering bus station transformed into landscapes of acidic geysers, bubbling with small, unpleasantly bursting bubbles. Another glossy explosion ended with a vibration in my pocket. Marderface was calling. Lately, he'd been treating Marderface and me to all kinds of pharmaceutical barbiturates, so his call filled me with a trembling sense of hope. His mother worked in a trauma ward and had a night shift today. The stars had aligned in a complex pattern under the simple pretense of cleaning. The basement he had been ordered to tidy up seemed to me like a room capable of granting wishes. Marderface lived in a private house with an air of proprietorial grandeur. His father grew towering cannabis plants, which were laid to dry like the executed Romanov family in the attic for the winter. Like a proletarian worker, Marderface plucked these sticky, dense buds from different parts of the plants. Meanwhile, his mother often brought home items that, formally speaking, weren't part of her salary, but came from her grueling job. As a result, this basement held a strategic reserve of various hospital-related items. Initially, we had pilfered copper coils and haloperidol from thermedication used to exorcise the demons lingering in our minds after our ritual. The problem was that we'd never had the chance to thoroughly overturn the place and inspect it properly. When Marderface called me, I saw it as a sign, and Marderface and I set off without delay. The city streets, emerging from the cozy darkness of the apartment, greeted us with the scorching heat of a battered wasteland, accompanied by pervasive stench and distances that seemed even more vast and unpleasant in the heat. The intoxication from the past month of codeine gave way to the indifferent yawns of sedatives and sleeping pills, which we had consumed in the absence of anything better settling for this bleak substitute and all its miserable, creeping cousins. In a state of delirium, pseudo-revelations fell from our hands like shattered crystal goblets, the sound of their breaking mistaken for a battle cry. March! We ran, forgetting our names. Cutting our feet on shards strewn across our minds, we stumbled forward like stray dogs, lured by the promise of another fix. The residue left by such escapades became the note upon which we planned to begin another, equally horrifying path. Today marked the third confirmation of our previous choices. Winding streets, shrouded in the forgetfulness of surrounding shadows, mocked us as they pulled us from a pleasant half-sleep. The journey increasingly resembled an ordinary dream, devoid of thought. Even Marderface, who enjoyed brightening the trek with musings, now walked as though locked in constant battle with the urge to collapse. into the shadow of his own overpowering dreams. The city's noise, a lullaby of chaos, enveloped us. Above this march loomed a heavy cloud of desire to retreat, to vanish into the alleys, hoping for some mind-blowing miracle, something halfway between rain and awakening in Marderface's house. With every such thought, the dominant spirit of weakness, the kind learned at vocational schools, yearned for sanctuary in the nearest deserted thicket. Marderface marched with pride, which helped push forward with the last reserves of strength, avoiding the melted asphalt. The effects of diazepam and cibazon reached their peak. The dreamlike kingdom, breathing heat and distortion, welcomed us without ceremony. Descending into the depths of this dream, hoping to grab onto something material, I began to grope for a lifeline in the air. The boundless ocean of sleep yawned wide, swallowing the remnants of my humbled consciousness. The same was happening to Marderface. A drawn-out moan, evolving into a plea, mutating into a supplication, and finally decomposing into a threat. Following it comes a booming clang. In the forge of demiurges, the heat is forged, sparks flying as suns upon our world. The clang erases everything. The iron door of the entrance slams open, and out storms an enraged tenant. The entire yard is covered in watery vomit. And even without deductive skills, it's easy to trace the culprits responsible for its appearance. Away from the vomit-streaked bench and the overturned trash can, worn tracks in the grass lead at a steep angle to a flower bed. Behind the torn-up soil and a piece of uprooted fencing, a faintly moving silhouette can be seen. While my body remains futilely resisting the shackles of sleep, my mind is fully awake, signaling the approach of a conflict. Marderface, moving clumsily in an attempt to escape the yelling tenant of the defiled courtyard, vaults over another small fence, crushing flowers and breaking the neat little supports of a recently planted tree. The swearing and shouting summon more residents like crazed hyenas, finding themselves a livelier targetone, barely able to move. Blows with sticks quickly bring the body back to its senses, and soon we're both sprinting side by side in a desperate marathon of escape. The yard dead ends into garages and the corner of another building. The mob closes ranks, a ram's horn sounds. The clearest threat is a call to the police, prompting us wordlessly and helping each other to scramble up onto a garage roof. Small stones fly, too tiny to fully convey the spectrum of emotions fueling their throwers. The splatter of vomit below, from the rooftop perspective, appears artistically refined. Sadness replaces my initial irritation. The seconds fly by so fast that even the throbbing pain from the stones fails to fully register. Heat, nausea, pain, and judgmental shouts mixed with threat sway felt like ancient prophets, ready to be destroyed for what had escaped our mouths. The journey through the graveyard of garages passed in a sobering flash. Only after catching our breath and putting a decent distance behind us did we notice how battered, filthy, and covered in vomit we were. My forehead was unpleasantly tight, with a web of dried blood seeping from the depths of my disheveled, matted hair. In one of the garage graves, we spotted the father of a former classmate, engaged in strange activities. Recognizing him vaguely, we tried to pretend our predicament was none of his concern, slipping away at an unnatural angle down the long corridor of closed garages. In that silence, his muttered shit show felt like a peculiar hello, to which we quietly responded in kind with, yeah, a total shit show. The further we distanced ourselves from the urban neighborhoods and approached the village, the more relieved we felt. That burdensome part of our informational shells had been left behind, along with the angry residents and the sun-scorched, deserted streets. The effects of the drugs were wearing off, replaced by self-loathing, anger, and a hint of rational regret. The village greeted us with its mysterious, almost mythical atmosphere. Every crooked little house, every overgrown lot, every plant-choked corner felt otherworldly. Late autumn would have been the perfect time to acquaint oneself with this place. Then, it reveals a mysteriously familiar image. Like something glimpsed before but forgotten amidst life's chaotic scene from the warmest childhood memories. In late autumn, hurried, disheartened people attend to their business, and the scent of coal lingers faintly in the air. Rare cars crawl quietly down the streets, cautiously navigating the potholes that make the place resemble the moon's surface. Mud, dampness, and bare trees drive people into the cozy embrace of their home. Empty spaces cannot remain vacant for long. Shadows take their place. In those fleeting moments when people possess shadows, the village, as a narrator, could reveal far more. But now, in the blazing midday heat, shadowless and pride-stripped, we trudge toward the Manipovor's house with the last of our strength. After what felt like an unintentionally long pause, we finally dared to call Manipovor once we reached his house. Inwardly, it felt as though something irreversible had happened during that hour, that he might have died, decomposed, and grown into a beautiful tree. With these thoughts in mind, I stared at him as he opened the gate. It was clear he was trying not to dwell on our battered, filthy appearance. In his yard, enormous guard dogs flitted about, their very presence terrifying me to the core. They seemed to remember me, circling like sharks as we made our way into the house. Marderface, his face equally tense, stuck close by, clearly torn between rushing ahead to safety and fearing that doing so would provoke the dogs to attack. Inside the house, it was unwelcoming and silent. After our long trek and the day's events, Manipovor's hearth-a-sticky grandmotherly presence seemed to reach out to us, wanting to embrace us like lost grandsons, offering fleeting warmth and nostalgia. The smell of books, dust, heat-warped wood, and a faint hint of rotting vegetables probably awaiting autumn somewhere nearby pervaded the air. Pots filled with dog food sat on the floor. One lid askew revealed a dark something, a lurking embodiment of subconscious evil, silently observing us, studying our movements, assessing our danger and potential. Coming down from the drugs, it was hard to resist the urge to howl or hide. We both looked as though we were on the verge of breaking down in a raw, almost primal, folk-like lament over something deeply familiar and irretrievably lost. Manipovor busied himself with clutter by the basement entrance, wordlessly pulling out dusty suitcases, broken crates, and old burlap sacks. We formed a pioneer-like chain, passing the items along, with Marderface at the end, hauling everything outside. The dogs continued to circle him, and he continued to battle his instinct to bolt. The monotony of the process sent my thoughts wandering into abstract horizons of paranoia. After a few minutes, I began to feel that something terrifying lurked in the darkness hidden by time and shielded by the junk like armor, a manifestation of time's objectified form. Its tendrils, like a reptile's egg clutch, brimmed with latent potential. Every item I touched felt like a parasite planting itself in my mind. A motorcycle helmet with a burnt front that spilled a pair of rotting dusty leaves when passed. A curtain rod wrapped in tarpaulin, its rings wriggling like mischievous creatures. A broken fishing rod, behind which, after some struggle, emerged a horrifyingly shaped fishing net, tangled with hooks and bits of seaweed. A large but empty sack, followed by a sequence of clattering tin cans and boxes. Just as the last shred of hope for a favorable outcome of this endeavor began to fade along with our already dim mood, Manipovor signaled us to descend. Seeing the basement in such a state surprised me deeply. In my memory, it had been a tiny, cramped space piled high with junk we'd rummaged through in search of crookedly lying treasures. More a cellar than a basement, with a simple step-down ladder entrance. But now, brightly lit, It had transformed into something incomprehensibly vast. Wooden shelves lined the walls, so it seemed. Upon closer inspection, it became clear that these weren't walls, but the basement's continuation. Mirrored by other shelves, so heavily laden with junk, they formed impenetrable barriers. True walls of clutter. After catching our breath and adjusting to the dim light, we began, like ants, to dismantle the piled debris. Spotting a section of boards nailed tightly together, Manapovo attacked them with a crowbar, producing inhuman sounds. A peculiar excitement overtook me after all. His house was quite old, and his neighborhood was from the wartime era. According to his stories, the house had been built by Italian pals who had somehow ended up here. The basement resembled more of a bomb shelter, something uncommon for private homes. But at this moment, it didn't seem strange at all. Soon he victoriously tossed aside the crowbar and began to relish his handiwork, catching his breath. The thrill of discovery quickly turned into unease as a cold, musty draft wafted from the dark breach. A hollow feeling stirred in my stomach as Manapojiratil handed us flashlights and proceeded into the darkness. Hearing his exclamatory, "Whoa!" followed by a more assertive, "Wow!" we hurried after him. In my life, I had been stunned countless times, but this moment stood out as one of the most profound. Behind the mound of junk, the clutter, and the basement's shadowy atmosphere lay a room not just a space or chamber, but an abandoned room. It had furniture, arranged as if someone had just left it, and a door leaning at an odd angle against the far wall. At first glance, the room with its crooked door seemed chilling, almost menacing. But as I looked closer, it appeared as if someone, bored, had assembled a makeshift room out of odds and ends. Then, after another moment, the sinister atmosphere returned with doubled intensity. Spotting windows on the walls, I began to see everything in an ominous light. This was all deeply strange windows, wallpaper, a makeshift door. How long had it been here? 10 years? 20? It became clear why we had initially mistaken it for a wall. It looked like these sections of fake wall had been nailed in place from the inside. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of someone sealing themselves inside this false room, and the urge to leave grew stronger. Even after prolonged inspection, it was unclear how one could nail themselves in and then exit. Though the walls had wallpaper, behind it was solid concrete or earth. The opposite wall where the crooked door leaned was partly a massive protruding boulder that vanished into the ground. And the windows? They were embedded directly into the wall, incapable of opening. The unsettling strangeness of the scene was mirrored on Marderface's face, his silence saying it all. In one corner stood an open, empty wardrobe. To its right, there was a bed with sheets and a small nightstand. Beneath the window to the left was a table and 2 chairs, and in the far corner, another wardrobe stood. Unlike the first, this one was boarded up with planks, heavily reinforced from the outside. The sheer number of boards made it hard to recognize it as a wardrobe at first glance. The sight of this sealed wardrobe drew not fear, but curiosity, a stark contrast to the eerie incomprehension that everything else evoked. The deeper we ventured into the room, the further the comforting notion of escape receded, not in terms of distance, but something existential, tied to life itself. The hole we had entered through stared back at us, like the fisheye lens of a silent, watchful predator. It felt like an exit, but also a trapdoor to fate that could vanish without warning. Manapojiratil pried off the boards one by one with his crowbar, the sound echoing sharply. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark hole leading back. It felt as though if I lost sight of it for even a second, it would disappear, leaving us trapped here forever. The clattering sound of the last boards being torn away broke the tension, replaced by a heavy silence that made me wonder what had just happened. Was the wardrobe empty, and they were now standing awkwardly before a voir dire worse? When I turned around, I forgot everything else. The reason for their silence became clear. The wardrobe was packed full to bursting with vials, blister packs, medications, and first aid kits. All the fear drained from me in an instant as I threw myself into the pile alongside everyone else, frantically sorting through the treasure spilling onto the floor. As we crawled on our knees, the sounds of our jackpot packaging hitting the ground, ampoules clinking gradually faded into the rustling of boxes and our muttered comments about the items we found. Manipogiratil, more experienced in identifying morphine and codeine derivatives, sifted carefully through the pile, and we deferred to his judgment. After 10 minutes of sorting through countless nearly identical labels in the dim light, the initial rush wore off. Soon, every similar-looking name seemed familiar, and we tossed most of it back into the pile without even reading. The wild thrill we'd felt when the wardrobe first opened faded into disappointment and exhaustion, accompanied by the rhythmic throb of a headache. While they held out hope for some miraculous discovery, I wandered over to the bed by the wall and sat down. The metal mattress creaked beneath me, sagging deeply in an almost indecently accommodating way. Memories of Soviet-era hospital beds flooded back those devouring frames that trapped you within their sagging embrace. As I lay down, the cold dampness of the basement floor seeped into me, oddly soothing, like a massage for my frazzled mind. Waves of residual diazepam coursed through me, blending into a numb calm. Watching the two of them monotonously sift through the mountain of tiny boxes, I found myself surrendering to exhaustion. The pile of containers, the open wardrobe, and the two dimly lit figures gradually dissolved into the warmth of sleep. The last thing I saw was the dark, looming figure of the wardrobe, motionless but ominous in its presence. A sudden jolt of terror yanked me out of sleep. Startled and disoriented, I scrambled to my feet, only to trip over a box near the bed. Flailing on my back, I attempted to crawl away, my voice caught in a silent scream. Marderface and Manipogiratil rushed to my side, laughing nervously and confused. "There's someone in the corner," I shouted, crawling backward. "Where?" Manivore grabbed the flashlight lying on the floor and swung its beam quickly across the room. The light swept from one cabinet to another and stopped in the corner where they had been sitting, illuminating a tall mirror turned with its reflective side toward the wall. The construction of the mirror was such that it could rotate on its axis when pressed on one side. Manivore walked up to it. Strange that I didn't notice this right away. He began dragging it into the middle of the room, pulling it over the pile of scattered medicine packages. "Heavy," he puffed, working harder to move it. When he finally managed to pull it far enough from the wall and spin it on its axis, instead of a reflective surface, another black surface appeared. "Maybe it was broken a long time ago, or it just had some kind of top layer," suggested Marderface. "How much could this sell for?" muttered Manivore, shining the flashlight over the surface and examining the legs and central fittings. The surface where the mirror should have been shimmered with a peculiar darkness, almost like it was made of anthracite coal. Manivore circled the mirror, examining it closely and spinning its center. As it turned again, the flashlight beam briefly glinted off the dark surface. Grabbing the flashlight, I meticulously inspected the spot where the flash had just been. Upon closer examination, I realized it was indeed a mirror, but its surface had been painted over multiple times with thick, dark paint. Trying to scrape the paint with a fingernail proved ineffective, so we started looking for something sharper. Manivore was visibly worried that we might scratch the surface. It was clear he already wanted to sell it, and was eager to move the conversation towards taking it out of the basement. With cautious movements, he squeezed through the opening and began enlarging it from the outside to ensure the mirror would fit through. Meanwhile, Marderface was packing the pile of medicine he had set aside into a bag, focusing on anything with unfamiliar or intriguing names. In this absurd sequence of events, everyone found something to occupy themselves with, while I wandered back and forth across the room, lost in strange thoughts. Without any agreement, they were already tilting the mirror and trying to squeeze it through the opening. I felt uneasy being the last one to leave. Manivore, along with the flashlight, was already outside. As they struggled to maneuver the long, unwieldy mirror through the opening, I picked up the bag of medicines and looked once more into the deepening darkness at the far end of the room. My thoughts wandered in anxious and uncertain directions. In a way, I wanted to reach some kind of resolution, a final understanding that would separate me from the need to engage with such things again. To create a point of perception, a stable mental space from which I wouldn't have to revisit these unsettling experiences. These thoughts were internal and subtle, reflected only by the occasional chewing of the inside of my cheek as I stood in the darkness, trying to avoid a full-blown spiral of destructive emotions. Once again, Manivore had let us down in a way, and it was starting to feel like all of this was some convoluted scheme of his, an elaborate act of petty revenge born out of envy, resentment, and a desire to seem closer or better friends than others. Everything about his past behavior and broken promises seemed to converge here in this bizarre adventure. Even today's escapade, intended to search for and enjoy whatever pharmaceuticals we could find, had been derailed by the chaos surrounding this mirror. My suspicions were confirmed when I noticed the pre-prepared carts and elastic straps stashed in the shadows near the yard's exit. We hadn't noticed them earlier, probably because we'd been too distracted by exhaustion. Now, all the pieces of Manivore's selfish plan were coming together, forming a crude and poorly executed picture. The stairs and the subsequent exit from the house proved to be the most challenging part of the journey. Within 5 minutes, we were all drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and gloomily realizing there wasn't enough space to turn the mirror toward the exit. That's when Manivore suggested taking it out through a window on the opposite side of the house. The first 2 windows were painted shut countless times and wouldn't budge except for the small vent windows. The window in the living room was too close to a large cherry tree, so the only option was the bedroom of his grandmother, who had passed away the year before. In her bedroom, we quickly opened the windows and started maneuvering the mirror out. The room radiated a quiet melancholy. The old cabinets were closed, and the shelves were empty, as if no one had ever lived there. For a brief moment, I felt as though his grandmother was sitting on the edge of the bed, crying. It wasn't a physical vision, but rather a sensation, a knowledge transmitted at the edge of consciousness. A moment later, she seemed to be sitting on top of the mirror, laughing loudly. At that instant, the part of the mirror I was holding slipped from my hands, becoming unbearably heavy. The moment was reflected on Manivore's face. He squinted, bracing himself for the sound of shattering glass. But instead of falling, the mirror spun upward around its axis, miraculously avoiding a collision with the ground. Once we overcame that obstacle, we started strapping it to the cart with elastic ropes. Despite repeated attempts, something always went wrong. The mirror would tilt at a precarious angle, slip out of place, or its protruding legs would scrape against the ground. I taped the bag of medicines to one side of the mirror, considering my contribution done. Finally, after improvising extended handles using curtain rods we'd taken from the basement earlier, Manivore managed to get the mirror rolling. We opened the gate, and with a few approving words and a promise to share the profits from selling it, Manivore sent us on our way. He watched us intently as we walked out of the yard, still putting on a show of concern, before slamming the gate behind us with a loud bang to mark his departure. "It's not his mirror anymore," Marderface said, and I fully agreed with him. We headed back to the apartment. The journey felt eternal, no exaggeration. Within 10 minutes, the improvised handles had broken. Hunched over, we took turns squatting under the cart, pushing it from below. After an hour, we finally reached the railway tracks. But by then, we physically couldn't push it any farther. We took the mirror off the cart and carried it by hand. Every 20 steps, we stopped, trying to remember how our arms were supposed to bend. It was already starting to get dark outside, and the path ahead blurred into shadows. The final stretch became an infinite trail of suffering, stretched further by constant breaks. The hardest part was finding a reason to keep going purpose. Worse still was the realization of how far we'd already come. That alone drove us forward. When we finally saw our yard, a strange surge of distorted energy returned, enough to power us through those last steps and drag the mirror inside. We left it in the hallway and headed home, but after walking a bit away from our rehearsal apartment, I suddenly remembered the bag. I wanted to sit down at home, peacefully browse the internet, and research the names on it. So we turned back. At the threshold, I was struck by a strange déjà vu. For a moment, I hesitated to step inside. Thoughts in this déjà vu spoke to me in a mocking voice. Don't forget to look in the mirror now that you're back. But in this moment of déjà vu, it was as if I was reminding myself to say these words in the future. Only the strangeness lay in the fact that these words had no clear origin. In the future, they were said because they'd been heard earlier. Now, they came from some imagined future. It was as if I was teasing myself for having once heard them here. Even stranger was the thought. The most important thing is to remind myself to say this. It all felt more like a password that had to be spoken on the threshold. Only after saying it did, I finally switched on the light. Seeing the same dark mirror with the bag taped to its center making, it looked like some mysterious, pregnant dark creature. I ripped it off and lingered for a moment near the non-reflective surface, adjusting my hair, pretending to look at my reflection. Then, an even more unnatural, chaotic déjà vu hit me. As though there was another life somewhere, filled with different events. It felt like today's experiences were merely distorted, meaningless sensations destined to fade away. In those moments, I became convinced that my entire life, this whole world, existed in the darkness of that mirror behind its painted-over blackness. Our whole world, too, was coated in thick, oily darkness, enabling us to exist. Fleeting revelations flashed like lightning, throwing quick questions and answers into my mind. I struggled to latch onto recognizable images in this flood of awareness. The most resilient impression left behind was a world much like ours, but slightly different. As the fleeting visions faded into nothing, they left only fragmented sensations behind. These sensations told their story more eloquently than any attempt to organize the fleeting images. I couldn't retain any of the pictures in my memory, but I kept their haunting feeling as I made my way home. At home, no one was waiting for me. It was midsummer, and my parents had gone to the seaside. Instead of relaxing, I sat down to research the names on the medications. Almost all of them had cryptic alphanumeric labels like ZRV-VSTL-1I-1B4, VTT-1-3A, OO-24C-7A, KDD-5U, and so on. Typing these into search engines yielded results completely unrelated to medicine most, often links to government institutions dealing with road construction, food standards, or specifications for solid fuel boilers. Sometimes, bizarre diagrams appeared resembling mechanical, crucified, totem-like animals. With each new identical name I entered, I forgot why I was even looking them up. There was so much information that its utter uselessness became invisible. Another surge plunged me deeper into the digital junkyard. My eyes no longer noticed typos in the names I typed, and my brain stopped registering them. After several failed attempts, I gave up. By the end of my fruitless searches, my monitor seemed to blend into the wall, transforming into a primitive cave painting. Drifting in a storm of chaotic, floating names, I collapsed onto my bed and gladly sank into sleep. Expecting a long, dark slumber after such an exhausting day, I instead found part of myself still awake. Before my closed eyes appeared the image of the mirror we had brought back, standing in the apartment's hallway in the dark. Its presence was impossible to see in the total darkness, but faint pulsations hinted at its existence. These quiet beats grew louder, like the pulse of a heart filled with dread. The mirror seemed to declare itself alive, though it resided in its own kind of afterlife, dreaming of this world. The dark paint that coated its surface was its coffin light no one seemed eager to lift. What struck me most was the fact that someone had painted over the mirror in the first place and hidden it away. While these thoughts were flashing before my eyes, the image of the dark doorway with the mirror faded, and I was instead confronted with a familiar but eerie vision of that creepy apartment. Slowly, details emerged, crawling like quick insects back into their rightful places. In an instant, my will over these thoughts was gone, and I was left as a horrified observer of the unfolding scene. The frozen living room reappeared, the same trousers limp over the back of the chair, the vase with dried flowers, the bowl of candy and crackers, and the glass of vodka. This time, however, the movement didn't lead to the kitchen, but instead to the window, beyond which lay the ominous closed bedroom radiating a palpable terror. On the sideboard, there was a photographer man who didn't resemble the dream's sinister host, but rather looked like an ordinary elderly person. The figure I had encountered last time, with his demonic and grotesque appearance, seemed like evil itself, twisted and reshaped from human flesh. As the movement shifted toward the window, the bright light was replaced by the view of towering buildings' chaotic clusters of 9-story blocks stretching to the horizon. Peering through the cloudy glass, I struggled to make out the scene. My eyes refused to focus, and I soon realized that it wasn't the window that was blurred, but my vision itself. That realization triggered a moment of clarity, just long enough to glimpse something terrifying. What I had mistaken for apartment blocks were, in fact, grave markers stretching endlessly into the cemetery beyond. The window, which initially seemed like a square, became a curved, convex portal, forming the outlines of a tombstone portrait. The room's previous coziness evaporated entirely, yet the transformations were so subtle that they didn't betray themselves externally. The creamy wallpaper became the satin lining of a coffin. The sofa became the cushioned bottom, pressing against my back. The vase with dried flowers and the bowl of candy now appeared outside the window alongside the glass of vodka. Suddenly, the room itself vanished. Feeling suffocated and trapped, I realized with horror that I was inside a coffin. The dread that consumed me was further amplified by the realization that I couldn't wake up. "There is nowhere to wake up to," echoed a voice in my mind. "This life of yours, it's all just a dream." Even that terror was dwarfed by the horrifying realization that I was inside a corpse, which was slowly digesting my soul. In place of wild panic came something otherworldly and forgotten, a kind of instinctual drive to preserve my soul at all costs. Familiar rhythmic words echoed in my consciousness, creating a kind of mantra that seemed to rebuild the world around me. House, room, sofa, bed, chair, sideboard, flowers, candy, bedroom, house, room, sofa, bed, chair, sideboard, flowers, candy, bedroom. The pressure of the coffin walls began to subside, replaced by the familiar, blinding light of the window. Yet, I couldn't stop repeating the mantra it echoed over and over, even as the room restored itself. It wasn't until I realized that the words weren't coming from me at all that they started to fade. They drifted upward, dissolving into some unreachable space, yet I could still sense their quiet repetition. When I thought it was all finally over, a piece of paper appeared on the table, bearing a single word: Oblivion. Reading it, I woke up. Despite the dream's hyper-realistic nature and its strange semblance of revelation, the details scattered like fleeting fragments as I opened my eyes. They frightened me with their sense of inevitability, yet I found some comfort in the phrase that followed. It's just a dream. That thought made things a little easier. Lighting a cigarette and taking a small dose of barbiturates, I eased into the day ahead. Outside, the summer heat bore down, and people shuffled off to their destinations, leaving behind traces of their lives in places that had formed like spit from balconies along their paths. Cars crawled sluggishly, weaving strange, vague questions into the air. The scene outside the window inspired a quiet kind of awe, with its soft distance unwelcome to both the sun and those who moved boldly, as if to nowhere. From the tree of life, swaying like a cradle, a familiar Adidas cap fell to the ground. Beneath it, barely visible, a spider scurried, moving with the urgency of someone who had spent the entire night brewing a magical concoction. Realizing myself to be a shadow, I attached myself to the spider, becoming its shadow, and within 10 minutes we were on our way to its intricate web, which smelled faintly of iodine and vinegar. The city yawned in pretended indifference, revealing new yet familiar sounds. Along the way, I wanted to create a vortex that would grind human plans into dust. But lacking a reason, I simply watched attentively. Ritualistically sniffing the air to calm myself, I followed the spider down chaotic paths. There were plenty of reasons to pause and wander aimlessly, but none felt worth articulating. I wanted to coax the spider into a conversation, but its swift avoidance of any answers could make anyone envious. When our destination appeared on the horizon, I thought I caught the spider sighing with relief. That tiny, almost imperceptible gesture struck me as a profound act of hostility. The atmosphere turned tense, filled with the expectation of betrayal, so I called Marderface. Arriving at the apartment, I was met by scavengers who seemed to emerge from the depths of sleepless nights. They steered the conversation toward moralistic platitudes, urging us to share and to remember our brothers. Yet their tone betrayed their greed, and their words quickly grew thorny, pulsating with venomous undertones. The apartment's owner attempted to wrest back trivial items from their grasper toothpaste tube here, a winter sweater there while his speech grew increasingly disjointed with frustration. Eventually, the scavengers retreated, cursing and muttering ill wishes as they left. Meanwhile, my companion quietly prepared the VIN and disappeared into another room to inject it. Marderface was still nowhere to be seen, and my paranoia grew. I imagined the scavengers intercepting him on his way and dragging him to some bizarre pawnshop knot, one that dealt in ordinary stolen goods, but one that accepted stolen people, sleepless nights, and the frozen police officers hiding in refrigerators. An hour passed, stretching into an eternity of paranoid anxiety. But then he finally arrived. By that time, the others had already run laps around the apartment, cleaning the living room 3 times over. Marderface looked perplexed, like someone who had spent far too long contemplating something important. We drank the VIN, said our goodbyes, and headed back out into the world. The heat had barely subsided, but it was enough for the long walk ahead. The wind, a euphemism for amphetamines, slowly seeped into our systems, filling the world with an amazing sense of clarity and simplicity. All the past problems faded into the background. It was as if we were dismantling a mental construct down to the very last screw, only to reassemble it in a pure and comprehensible form. Delving deeper and deeper into the spiraling chase for the elusive meaning, we found ourselves at the entrance to the settlement, Memories of yesterday felt like smudged brushstrokes on Egyptian pyramids. Everything seemed so insignificant, as if this were our last day on Earth. Our conversations, at first just sparks of ideas, quickly turned into a full-fledged barrage of thoughts. My recounting of a dream morphed into a discussion of the bizarre, devouring nature of Manapojeratal, the Mana-Eater, then jumped to reflections on mirrors, and from there to Marderface's morning state of bewilderment. "You know," said Marderface, "this morning, even before I woke up, or maybe at the exact second I woke up, or even a second before I suddenly thought, or rather understood clearly, that all of this has already happened." He paused, then repeated himself for emphasis. "When I woke up, even before opening my eyes, I thought, this has already happened, and I knew that you would call me. But if you knew I was going to call," I said mockingly, "why did it take you 3 hours to get here?" "Because, in theory, I was supposed to come to you right away. I had already done that before, but I wanted to do it differently this time. To take a completely different route. To change my course constantly, go in different directions, stop halfway. Do things I normally wouldn't. And you know what? That had already happened too. Every supposedly unpredictable action I took, I'd already done it before. So, should we go punch the Mana-Eater? Maybe that's something we've never done before," I suggested. "No," said Marderface firmly. "If you're suggesting it, that means it's already happened. If we go, it means we've already beaten him up. And if we don't go, then that's already happened too. Whatever we do, it's already been done. I want to do something we've never done before. You get it? But the problem is, as soon as we try to do what we think we've never done, it turns out we've already done it. It's all happened to us before." He paused for a moment. Then his tone shifted into something darker. "So here's the question. If all of this has already happened countless, endless times, then that means it's not real. Not all reality, but this reality. Because it's just a repetition of something that once existed in its original form. And if this reality isn't real, then that means we're free to do whatever we want. This is just one of countless distorted reflections, an echo of echoes in an infinite chain of repetitions that will never stop. No God will ever punish us because we're not real. We're just a memory separated, copied endless line from those copies. More copies have emerged, each trapped in their own loops of endless repetition. This has no beginning and no end. It's the flood of the absolute. It's the first myth. How many gods have drowned in it? How much of God is even left in it? Does he even know where the real people are, and where those like us stuck in our unreality exist?" The weight of his words settled heavily within me. "So what's left then?" I asked, surprised by my own question, which seemed to escape my lips without my consent. A familiar sense of déjà vu rolled over me, accompanied by a disorienting sensation, as if my consciousness flipped over itself, leaving me dizzy and slightly nauseous. "In another situation," Marderface began, "I would blindly keep chasing something that wasn't, trying to find some primal originality. But with every time," he paused an uncharacteristic moment of hesitation, "with every time that I, in my endless repetitions of this conversation, speak these words. Suddenly, in my ears, I heard a quiet echo of his voice, delayed playback of his speech. With every time that I, in my endless repetitions of this. Instead of listening to Marderface in real time, I was fixated on the echoing copies in my mind. And just as I thought one echo had ended, another began, this time with a longer delay. The phrases flowed like traffic on a crowded highway, weaving between one another and filling every available gap. At first, I tried to latch onto one of them, to make sense of it, but I soon gave up and stopped understanding anything. Outwardly, none of this showed except for my involuntary attempts to blink away the mental noise without giving myself away. Marderface, oblivious to my recursive journey, had drifted infinitely far ahead in his monologue. I resisted the urge to interrupt him. It felt like a betrayal, an attack on a completely defenseless person. So I forced myself to focus and listen again. With every time that I, in my endless repetitions of this conversation, speak these words, it feels like I'm creating a small window for myself. A mental gap through which I can rise to the surface of a kind of awareness. Take a breath of timeless air from the present moment, and then dive back into this current that flows without me. And this conversation, it's not the essence. It's nothing more than a description of a past description. The essence is to follow your attempts, not to resist. Not to resist? I echoed, sure I had misheard him. Yes, exacto, not resist, he said, emphasizing the word not. Not resisting doesn't mean giving up and folding your arms. It means seeing where your powerlessness lies. How can I explain this? He paused, then pointed to the road where cars were slowly weaving around potholes. You see that stop sign? It's supposed to mean something, rules for the road or whatever. There are countless signs like that, and they're all about rules. Your internal constitution, your sensor, tells you in moments of monotony and repetition to fight, to look for a way out, to run blindly. From that perspective, resisting seems like something new or different. But that's the biggest lie. It's just the oldest, mossiest rut you can imagine. Because it's that rut that stops you from pausing for a moment and seeing that while the scenery might change in size or shape, the content doesn't. It's always the same. But if, in those moments of willpower, you stop resisting what's happening, you can step out of it. So take it however you want. There's no greater inaction than struggle. Or maybe, if you want to win, do nothing. Or, the sleeper fights for their fate, but the awakened doesn't. His final words filled me with an overwhelming sense of purpose, a desire to share this revelation with the world. Listen, I said. We can't just leave it like this. We need to share this with everyone. Maybe there are people out there waiting for their last clue, wandering in a half-dream. Let's write it down somewhere in big letters, right where everyone can see it so that anyone who's doubting can see and understand. Marderface agreed, and we set out to find paint. This task wasn't difficult. The screw had a way of quickly and effortlessly connecting someone with what they desired. Walking through courtyards emptied by the heat, we came across a couple of sheds. Nearby were some piles of manure and countless empty methadone bottles. The heat often clouds the mind, making it lazy. Almost missing this important sign, we started to leave. But on our way back, the puzzle of this brief message fell into place. Manure and methadone ether, first word that loomed in my mind, like a giant cloud of meaning, was constipation. Memories surfaced of garages near my house, where an abandoned Zaporozhet's car stood, also surrounded by manure and empty methadone bottles. Marderface respectfully agreed with me, and we hurried to get the paint. On our way, we encountered a few passers-by. Mistakenly greeting some of them, we ended up in bizarre, screw-like conversations about mutual acquaintances that didn't exist. These exchanges turned into a game of reacting to reactions from reactions. For instance, if someone said they knew Slavic, we built one narrative, but if they said no, another name would replace Slavic. People often shared more about themselves than necessary, but luck was not on our side during the journey. Each attempt to impose ourselves or gain some fleeting benefit led to increasing resistance. My gaze kept darting from the people to the surrounding houses, and I found myself recognizing these streets in faint, faded memories. I kept catching myself thinking that my long-lost childhood had never truly existed. Instead, it was conjured up in these moments, offering a plausible excuse for why it must have happened. It justified vague images of the past with an unbiased thirst for generosity and colors dredged from oblivion. The open world, the ability to wonder and rejoice, seemed to be escaping my current memory, fleeing from the unrealized future to calmer places. My screw-induced train of thought raced far beyond the ability of my conversation partners to be deceived by my humble, nostalgic attempts to charm them. Instead of speaking to people, I spoke to my memories. Before I could stumble, my body was already moving on to the next interaction, consumed by an unhinged calendar in which all the important things were disappearing in a whirlwind of torn pages. Language, shadows, surfaces, sensations, torn from reality, glances into the past, into judgment, speech aimed at the future, strange signs from shadows, the road, a distant shout, seemingly from a car maybe swearing, but it sounded like someone was rehearsing. Energy was strange, like a dry run. A shadow rushed after the car, followed by a lazy surface, as if to give everything that happened a stage to play out on. Someone laughed, then shuddered, noticing the attention it drew. Where was this happening? Maybe in the shadows, or was someone speaking? Nothing could be seen or felt. If someone asked me what I was at that moment, I would have said I was an ironing board, standing in a closet at an angle. More humane minds would probably ask the ironing board what it was, and without a moment's hesitation, it would describe my life. Except without shadows, speech, surfaces, or sensation. And I would describe it in turn and win. Shadows again, but now in memories. And now the speech was about my attempts to concentrate. Then someone, in a playful tone, said, "Can you imagine? He's thinking about speech, but speaking with thoughts." Another, more sardonic voice added, "Shh, be quiet. What if he starts thinking us?" But the first voice grew bolder, feeling the attention. Without verbally denying what had happened, it gleefully replied, "No, but seriously, can you imagine? And now he's thinking all of this." The second voice burst out laughing, pleading, "Stop! I can't, it's too much. My flatness hurts." Something was happening, and I couldn't figure out what. Just nonsensical repetition of absurd phrases. In empty nothingness, shapeless savages danced, pulsated, and writhed. The two voices, still in their chuckling tone, continued. Now, instead of phrases, they repeated just words. Flatness, shadows, speech, sensations. The mockery turned into an argument, and then it morphed into music. One voice quickly repeated, "Flatness, flatness, flatness," while the other played along, "Shadows, sensations, shadows, sensations." Soon, the words became indistinguishable, replaced by "poo-poo poots too," "poo-poo poot twos," happening somewhere nearby, laying the feeling of shadows on the featureless void. Pull the bag, the paint's leaking. Is it flowing? So, how does it feel? Marderface rhythmically squeezed the paint bag in sync with his breathing. He looked fresh and lightning quick, as though he had just appeared there, summoned by Zeus himself with a lightning bolt. Glancing back at the toxic chaos I had just emerged from, the surroundings hesitated to form a coherent picture, respectfully leaving space for the potential void of the paint fumes. It had grown noticeably darker. Clouds had appeared in the sky, and it felt as though several hours had passed, completely erased from my memory. The last thing I remembered was some strange people-thing the memories cut off. Glancing at myself, I slowly noticed that my shorts were smeared with dark red paint at the knees, as if someone had performed a late abortion directly on them. Looking at Marderface, it was easy to imagine he was the one who had clumsily devoured that aborted something. "Your face is covered in paint. You look like a cannibal at a feast," I said, laughing hysterically. "So is yours," he replied, bursting into laughter with his entire body. "How are we supposed to go anywhere like this?" I couldn't find the words and just waved my hands, as if somehow that would help. "Well, let's sit here for now. There's still plenty of paint left," he said, attempting to lift the bag to his face, spilling it down his neck. We were surrounded by garages, bushes, and an abandoned Zaporozhets. The origin of the paint was unknown to me, Another example of the screw's magic. Part of the day had also evaporated, as if sacrificed in exchange for this can. The screw's effects bordered on a chaotic, toxicomanic structure of reality, dictating its own rule. The ground was littered like fallen leaves, with empty vials of tramadol and methadone. Syringes appeared sporadically, like rare acorns. Piles of excrement dotted the area, but the smell of paint overpowered them. These piles stood proudly, as if having entered this place, they expelled their people and no longer needed them. Beneath the overcast sky, they existed on equal footing with humans, cemeteries, seas, and nuclear bombs. Perhaps someday, someone would step into one and let out a resigned F. And in that moment, that small would find itself separating from the person. It would drift off to join other S, born of pain, disappointment, and regret, blending into even subtler fabrics of existence. But the same sun shines down on both me and this pile of crap, so what makes me any better? What makes me more complex? A justification for the formless striving towards nowhere. While my thoughts fawned over the excrement, my purpose for being here began to return to me. Supposedly, we were looking for paint to write a giant inscription capable of awakening people from the dream of life, even if only distantly. Hey, you know what I just realized? I sprang to my feet, not yet fully forming the downward surge of energy into a clear thought. No one will see us. We'll be invisible to ordinary people because I have willpower. The cops won't catch us, we'll simply be invisible. You'll believe just as I do. I believe, shouted Marderface, springing up and, for dramatic effect, dipping his hand in paint and smearing it across his face like war paint. He then smeared some on me. See, you have to partake, he said, swiftly grabbing the paint can, taking a swig, and passing it to me. Without much resistance, I swallowed the viscous, bitter, cooling liquid. We transformed into ancient, timeless warriors berserkers of reality, descending from the longships of muddled consciousness. What could mere mortals do when faced with such forgotten, otherworldly figures? Their minds would instantly censor us along with themselves, making us invisible. For added intimidation, we began growling and shaking the bushes around us. After the bushes, I turned my attention to the garages and started loudly slapping the walls with my palms. Marderface jumped on the Zaporozhets, howling. Continuing this primal noise, we crawled out of the dead-end garages and headed toward what we deemed the best spot for our inscription. Having left the cozy, enclosed space, the giant open expanses overwhelmed us. They resembled foggy, water-filled depths. Beings, whether people or unnamed inhabitants of this world, silently withdrew. The growls we emitted failed to spread in such a viscous medium. I felt like I was beginning to suffocate. A sudden fear gripped me. What if our protective chant failed? Marderface, sensing my changed vibrations, also held his breath, as if afraid of the air poisoned by sobriety. But I believed, and belief drove me forward. Every new step crunched beneath me. Somewhere in the distance, a sliver of the moon was visible. On its surface, my steps echoed, unheard by any unsmall crunches in a vacuum. Barely perceptible bubbles of air rose quickly upward as we bent lower and lower, yielding to more naive beings. Crawling in jerky reptilian bursts, twisting and hissing, we moved. Something colossal stirred behind us, making us crouch even lower. An old garbage truck slowed at a turn. Without hesitation, we jumped out and barked at the garbage collector hanging onto the side rail. The sight of us sent a shockwave of terror through him, throwing him several meters backward and knocking all the air from his lungs. Following the barking came hissing, accompanied by us clawing at the ground, mimicking predatory techniques. We moved backward, keeping our eyes on the now pale garbage collector. His feeble attempts to stand turned into a convulsive dance on the ground, accompanied by a panicked muttering. Ma, ma, ma. He kept trying to inhale but couldn't recover from the overwhelming surge of fear. Watching him, we reached a small grove where, blending with the shadows, we continued growling and howling more aggressively, shaking small trees and bushes. These relatively deserted outskirts led to the partial city center, with bustling streets and shadowy figures darting in the darkness. A fleeting glance back revealed a trail of scattered crumbs from lost speech. It zigzagged and broke into long gaps, as if mental chaos reigned in a state of disrupted gravity. Everything struck my head at once, flashes of the path, followed by prolonged blind spots dominating my attention. Each subsequent stretch of forgetfulness was guessed only by the dirty ground I had passed. The meaning of what had happened remained a mystery. While the clouds and descending night concealed us in shadows, something hostile ignited streetlights and windows in faceless buildings. I no longer had the strength to recognize familiar neighborhoods. Instead, blurred lights replaced them, connected by relatively identical lines. The solid ground, my last refuge for coherent thought, was lazily retreating into blind spots. One step felt like sinking into mold, the next like trying to strike a match in midair. Marderface drifted in and out of the boundaries of thought and form. I seemed to grab his hand, but every time it turned out, he was the one pulling me out of oblivion. Somewhere midway, we got lost in the center of a torn-up field. On all sides were identical black houses with countless blinding windows. Direction, time, and sequence had vanished. My growl turned into a wail, mournful and full of despair. A similar wail echoed nearby, but there was no way to figure out how to reach it. Even if I had summoned all my remaining willpower, I couldn't remember how to walk in a straight line. If I managed to stand, the necessary plane would shift in any direction but forward, and I would fall. One attempt ended with me moving my legs slowly while lying on my back, like a catamaran. Marderface was already somewhere very close, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything. Another cry echoed, but this time it came with sensations. "Get up!" Marderface pulled me, but I slipped through his hands onto the ground. I can't. The words came out of me in bursts, bitter and sour. "Get up! Don't puke while lying on your back." The surroundings shifted again. Something was leaving me. It felt like corruption, a taint. I was filled with it, born from disbelief, doubt, and vanity. How could I have been so careless and not seen the obvious? Marder, they poisoned us. Who are they? Marderface asked, holding my head tilted to the side. Them? Those who want to stop us. They poisoned us. Have you puked yet? No, I don't feel anything. They planted corruption, their hostile filth inside me. This shouldn't be happening. I can't remember when we went to the garages for paint. That's when they poisoned me. They wiped my memory and slipped something into me. Maybe it's those who serve the opposing force. Those who don't want us to go further. They're the ones who correct realities. They want to erase me, eliminate me. The surest way is to wipe my memory and poison me. I think I don't remember how we went for the paint either. I thought you remembered. So that means all this time they've been nearby, never letting us out of their sight, he said, lowering his voice to a whisper. We can't waste a single second. We have to confuse our tracks. Let them think we know nothing. Let them naively believe they have full control. Meanwhile, we need to keep moving, and I have an idea. The grim realization of the situation revived me. Wiping my mouth from the vomit with my hand, I stood up, filled with determination to move toward our goal. I think it's someone from the Opium God's lot. It seems they noticed us back then and just pretended nothing was happening. They led us astray, letting us think we were part of their ranks, but we must have left too many tracks, I said, confidently moving through the darkness. You're right, Marderface reluctantly agreed. I had the feeling from the start that things were going too smoothly. I kept forcing myself to stay vigilant, to not relax, and yet we fell for it so stupidly. Maybe the Mana Eater is involved. Did you notice how he suddenly tried so hard to befriend us? His constant attempts to treat us to things. Marderface clutched his head. It's so obvious now. How could we have missed it? And the mirror. And that room. The way he cleaned it. We were being played with, I muttered in disbelief. But then, why would he entrust us with that mirror? I don't think it's just a mirror. Marderface looked at me, puzzled. The bigger picture is starting to come together for me. They were sending me those dreams. They need me to sleep. Someone wants me to stop serving the farmer. They have ways to be everywhere, to reach anywhere. We need to stay awake, stay here, and not let them put us to sleep. We have to take more of the wind and finish the writing as quickly as possible so they think nothing has changed. We'll keep moving like before. There's not much left. Let's finish the writing quickly and get back to cooking. The realization of what had happened blinded us to the grimness of our situation. In this short span, the world had completely changed, and it became obvious that something exceptionally hostile and immensely powerful had turned its attention to us. All this time, it had merely been humoring us, lulling us into complacency and leading us down a false path, occasionally letting us feel momentarily powerful. While we had forgotten about the opium god over the past few weeks, it seemed he had not forgotten about Usand. In fact, was now very angry. From a state of battle frenzy, we shifted into stealthy movements, darting from cover to cover and advancing at a rapid pace. We dashed across illuminated streets, avoided people and cars, and made every effort to remain unseen. Each new sprint thrust me into another spiral of revelation, casting doubt on absolutely everything, including the plan itself. Over and over, I replayed it in my head, imagining every detail, but I feared that they were listening to my thoughts and anticipating our every move. Whispering this realization to Marderface, I suggested handing over all planning to him, but then I began to suspect that they could read his mind just as easily. Overcome by despair, I felt the nausea return. By now, we had reached our destination. An abandoned building of a Soviet-era trade chamber. Located right next to the market, the road leading from it branched out in nearly all directions. There couldn't have been a better spot. Marderface got to work. In the thick darkness, it was hard to make out the spacing of the letters he was painting. So after every letter he scrawled, I took a step back. He dipped his hand into the paint and began smearing it across the wall. Mentally, I could see the phrase taking form, and in my head, I was already outlining the final letter when suddenly an intense light hit my eyes. "Young men, what are you up to?" A deep voice came from behind the blinding beam. Instinctively, I turned away and glanced at the wall, seeing only the crookedly written phrase, "A sleeper fights for his destiny," which ended abruptly on the letter A. The sentence wasn't an assertion anymore. It was more like a question, trailing off with ellipses. The voice behind the flashlight continued, "What happened to you two?" A long whistle followed the voice. Another beam of light joined the first, making it blindingly bright, as if we were staring into the twin eye sockets of the opium god, who had caught us red-handed in our act of betrayal against him. "Put the can down, and both of you step out onto the road." The voice barked, now more forceful. This was followed by the crackle of a radio. "Yes, Olechka. We need a car at the market, main entrance. 2 of them. Copy that." "Good." Then the voice issued another sharp command for us to come out. "Write faster," I yelled at Marderface. unwilling to leave the message unfinished. After a brief hesitation, he dipped his hand back into the paint and began frantically scrawling letters under the glaring beams of the flashlights. "Hey!" I said. "Get over here now!" The voice moved closer, and so did the beams. I had no choice but to drop onto all fours and start growling. Marderface, meanwhile, continued to paint furiously. My growls seemed to have some effect. The beams stopped moving, but that wasn't enough for me. Along with growling, I started biting at the grass, pounding it with my fists, and doing small somersaults. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" said the first beam. "Look at that one on the ground. How? Are we even supposed to load them? The driver won't take them like this." "The trunk," replied the first. "Done," Marderface yelled, raising the paint can above his head and pouring it all over himself. Then he dumped the rest on me. "Rub it on yourself quick, we need to make ourselves completely invisible," he said. Instead of obeying the flashlight beams, we started smearing the paint all over each other. "I think we managed it. Now they definitely can't see us," Marderface said, trying to steady his breathing. For a moment, it seemed to me that we were truly invisible. The voices behind the beams of light fell silent, and their glow even seemed to become less aggressive. But everything was ruined by the appearance of two other large beams, accompanied by the growl of a beast. I understood that they wanted to feed us to it, and for some time, I even struggled with the urge to say it out loud. "They want to feed us to the beast," I said desperately. "Don't be afraid, we're poisoned. He'll spit us out, just wait and see." Marderface's voice came from above. Then they started dragging me toward the two blinding headlights. I heard the thud of a car door opening, then another. "I've been on duty for 20 years, but I've never seen anything like this," a laughing voice near the car said. "You don't say," added another voice nearby, also laughing. "Were they just born here or something?" "They're covered in paint," said the voice of the one dragging me, writing all sorts of nonsense on the wall, howling like animals. "We got a call from the station earlier. They were wailing in the bushes," the neighbors called it in. "Then they wandered over here, doing God knows what. Looks like they're high as hell, completely out of it. This one, my body suddenly lifted higher than usual, was just growling at us, throwing dirt. And that one? He was straight up eating paint. You can take them to the night shift or to the loony bin. Our shift is over, and now we have to clean up because of these idiots. Anyway, they're yours now," he said, and threw me at the feet of the cop standing by the car. Marderface crashed down next to me. The beams of light that had dragged us went out, and soft footsteps faded into the grass. A cigarette butt landed near my face, and the one who had been laughing earlier now deliberately ground it out slowly. Then, as if by accident, he kicked my head with the sole of his boot. "Do you need a special invitation? Get in the trunk now." There was no trace of his amusement left. "Move it!" Struggling to get on all fours, I was immediately knocked down by a shove to the back. His yelling turned from threatening to hysterical, almost comical. While we hesitated, offering no resistance, his repeated phrase, "quickly," started to sound like bistro. "Bistro! Bistro!" He kept knocking us down with the sole of his boot, careful not to stain himself with paint. His quieter partner, however, muttered under his breath, "They'll ruin the trunk, the paint's still wet. Just let them go. Where are we even taking them? Come on, we'll take them to the night shift, then drive to the shop, clean the car, and head to the hangars. It'll be fine. All right, enough lying around, get in the trunk," he said, suddenly sounding almost fatherly as he finally stopped his petty kicks. At that moment, I didn't want to climb into the trunk, but after being lifted off the ground, a shove to the back took care of it for me. Marderface fell on top of me. There was barely any space, and we started sticking to each other. Dirt and bits of grass clung to my hands, feeling like pimples erupting from the situation itself. For a while, we tried to get comfortable, but soon the need for that vanished. The car took off, and with every turn, we crashed into the walls of the trunk. The ride seemed endless. My mind kept slipping through the imagined bars of our impending imprisonment. Cold cell walls yawned with toothless mouths, and the time left in my life rotted away, devoured by those who had bested me. No, I thought, this isn't how it ends. We can still fulfill our duty. We can still serve. And whoever is watching me, let them see that my heart is pure and my soul is open. I am ready to serve, to follow the path set before me, with the heart given to me, with the flesh of substances living within me, with the mind that lives beyond me. I am ready to vanish into the beyond. A short prayer gave me strength, and a plan for escape descended upon me. Quickly, shouting over the noise in the trunk, I explained it to Marderface. There was nothing to fear. Any money waiting remained. One turn after another, followed by long stretches of driving and stops. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. The noise and darkness created a strange effect somewhere between hallucinations and a very deep sleep. Maybe this is sleep? And as if in response to that thought, the car slowly rolled onto gravel that crunched beneath the wheels, and then finally stopped. Time vanished again. After what felt like another eternity, there were footsteps, a lively conversation, the last phrase being, "Well, show me," and then the trunk lid swung open. Marderface was the first to tumble out and immediately started vomiting horrifying red paint. "They beat us badly, help!" he screamed, spitting out the red mass. I also collapsed onto the ground, expelling small spasms of red vomit. "Help us, please, help us." I tried to keep my eyes closed for a better effect. "They punched us really hard in the stomach," Marderface shouted, spewing another stream of red vomit. "We didn't even touch them!" The voice that had been kicking us in the back earlier now shrieked in horror. "I'm not taking them. Just look at them. They'll die on my shift," yelled a panicked cop stepping out of the station. "Help! They want to kill us!" Marderface threw himself at his feet in desperation. "Save us, officer." I also tried to crawl after Marderface. The cop recoiled in terror. "Let them go as soon as possible. I'm not accepting them. Are you out of your minds? Get lost, guys, now." He clapped his hands a couple of times for emphasis. My plan had worked, and still maintaining our dying act, we began helping each other walk away. The cops who had brought us in stood there with their mouths open, unable to say a word. From their dazed expressions, I imagined each of them was lost in thought. But I liked to think they had been defeated, as if time had frozen and we were disappearing further and further away while they remained in front of the open trunk, oblivious to the pause that had overtaken them. The infamous night station was at the farthest edge of our city. During the day, you could see towering slag heaps everywhere. At night, small patches of dense lights flickered in different directions. Not far from the night station was the Styrol plant, its heavy chemical stench seeping through the deeply embedded scent of paint. We walked through the shadows of courtyards for part of the way. But once we stepped into the light, we realized we needed to wash ourselves somehow. "There's only one place that can help us, the ammonia pond," Marderface said, waiting for my reaction. The ammonia pond, as the locals called it, was the most polluted body of water in the region, where various factories dumped their waste. Initially, these were relatively harmless substance soils, dyes, and chemical byproducts. But as pollution worsened, rumors and horror stories spread. Mercury, Tennessee tea, ammonia, acid, and according to some experts, even polonium. Eventually, it became impossible to tell truth from myth. Photos of the pond spread across the country. When I was a child, I remember seeing a delegation of American scientists on television, predicting an ecological catastrophe within 10 years due to contamination of groundwater. 10 years passed. The only measures taken were concrete blocks blocking the road to the pond and a few no-swimming signs long stolen for scrap metal. The one thing uniting nearly all the city's residents was the knowledge, instilled from childhood, that under no circumstances should anyone swim there. But we were going there to be cleansed. After everything that had happened, only that place could help us wash away our sins, be reborn, vanish from the sight of those who had exerted so much effort to obstruct our mission. Night had long entered its miniature stillness. Every alley, every turn, every courtyard concealed frozen scenes. Distant streetlights left floating green spots in the darkness. Sometimes, you'd catch sight of a lone figure trudging away from the present moment into their forgotten past. Occasionally, the night's serenity would be shattered by an intrusive car racing by, leaving behind only the settling silence. These moments were sacred, delivered in carefully measured doses throughout the journey. My gaze lingered on the burning night sky. Flashes darted from one star to another, forming fractal patterns, hints of an even deeper nightone concealed from nearly all living beings. Only a fevered, spiraling mind could detect the traces of what was to come. And then, carried by the inner night, we arrived at the ammonia pond. The acrid stench of countless evaporations cut through the paint's scent. In the night's glow, the pond looked eerily beautiful, refracting starlight into a violet shimmer that filled me with a strange sense of peace. "It's time to be reborn," Marderface said, stripping off his clothes and laying his keys, phone, and money on a rock. "It's time," I echoed, doing the same. Standing at the water's still edge, I wondered what I would become when I emerged, what I would be like tomorrow, in a week, in 100 years. These thoughts sank into the formless depths of my consciousness as my foot took its first step, then the second. Soon, the water was above my knees. From the corner of my eye, I saw Marderface, waist deep, scrubbing himself with his hands. I advanced slowly, stepping across the soft, unidentifiable lake bed. Occasionally, something crunched beneath my feet, and for a moment, I imagined it was the remains of those cops who had taken us, that they had been watching us, had set an ambush, knowing we would come here to cleanse ourselves only for the pond to reject them, dissolving them completely. Then I felt it. The paint was slipping away. Scooping water into my hands, I wiped my body and sensed the paint peeling off, dissolving, no longer constricting me. Marderface was already washing his face, standing chest deep. He turned to me, signaling that I should submerge myself completely. I stepped toward him and we clasped hands. Together, we plunged under the water 9 times. On the 9th dive, I opened my eyes beneath the surface, and reality blazed. There were more flashes, so many that I thought I was losing consciousness. But soon, everything settled back into place. We emerged from the water, and miraculously, not a single drop of paint remained on our bodies. With the paint, part of the anxiety had also washed away. We truly felt reborn. Strangely enough, not only was the paint completely gone, but we had emerged from the water entirely dry as if we had bathed in cold air. A new sense of power filled me. My thoughts aligned. First, we needed to pawn at least one phone and cook as much meth as possible to prevent them from reaching me through my dreams. Second, we had to find Marderface, uncover what those he served already knew, and learn their weaknesses. And third, the final, most extreme option was the ritual. That last resort was only necessary if things went wrong with Marderface. We quickly discussed our plan and, clad only in underwear, set off. Though the journey was long, within an hour, we were at my house. Dressed now, we headed for the pawn shop. The meth's effects had worn off after our cleansing, so we needed to cook more as soon as possible. The events of the past few hours already seemed like a distant memory. Passing the spot where, less than 5 hours ago, Marderface and I had crawled and howled, I barely recognized it. It looked more like a kindergarten sandbox that had shrunk year by year until it was no longer visible at all. Quickly reaching the pawn shop, we found ourselves in a classic 3 a.m. situation when the streets are empty, but there's a queue inside. The local elite, cheerfully chatting, clutching various electronic devices like cherished pets microwaves, irons, toasters, extension cords, hair dryers, electric kettles, an army armed with useless weapons. Each of them hurried, desperately lamenting when, instead of the expected amount, mere pennies appeared on the counter. At 3 a.m., the most genuine emotions played out here. People cried and laughed, made acquaintances, and fought, all within 5 minutes. After pawning Marderface's phone, we rushed straight to the daytime cook, weaving frantically past illuminated sections of the streets. The pawn shop was nearby, and to save time, we bought the necessary syrups at the closest pharmacies. Since out of the entire kitchen, they were the only ingredients we needed, the cook had plenty of the rest. As we wandered through yet another dark courtyard, the sound of iodine being evaporated drifted from a 4-story building, filling me with warmth and comfort. Billions of multicolored dots flickered in the sky, and the anticipation of cooking made my stomach churn. A familiar feeling, a sign that everything would go very well. Another omen. Reaching the cook's house, we lingered under his windows, clicking our tongues to signal him. The entrance to his building was locked, illuminated by an incriminating lamp. We stayed in the shadows, wary of being seen. There was no doubt he was home, but finding the golden balance to ease him out of his paranoid thoughts and make him show himself was proving difficult. A couple of times, we almost caught a glimpse of the curtains shifting in the dark window, but nothing more. He was too cautious. Eventually, in a desperate move, we began calling out our names after clicking our tongues. When something flickered in the window again, I pulled a bottle of syrup from the bag and waved it. That finally worked. Instead of letting us in, the cook bolted outside, gesturing with a nod for us to follow him as he disappeared into the darkness. Slowly and cautiously, we trailed behind, glancing around occasionally. Guided only by the sound of hurried footsteps, we navigated through garbage-strewn gaps between garages, bushes, and barely visible trails. His route constantly shifted, and soon we ended up near his house just from the opposite side. Finally, he explained in a breathless, stumbling voice where we were going and where his kitchen was. By then, we didn't care. We just wanted to cook as much speed as possible and vanish into the most deserted spaces. 10 minutes of wandering later, we reached a 4-story building with a couple of lit windows. "That's the place," the cook said, pointing to the second floor. A relatively young guy opened the door. Someone, not yet completely consumed by speed, but clearly running on at least a week without sleep. He put a finger to his lips and drew out a long shh. "My sister and the baby are sleeping," he whispered. He motioned for us to follow and shut the door behind us. The apartment reeked of past cooking. The entire kitchen was laid out on the floor of the room. The process had begun. Everyone was busy with something, and gradually I began slipping into mental voids again. The apartment owner started shaking a bottle to separate the syrup when a baby's cry suddenly broke out from the other room. His sister entered, cradling the crying infant. "Are you fucking insane?" she hissed. He quickly ran to the bathroom, grabbed a towel, and wrapped it around the bottle, still shaking it. His sister, rocking the crying baby, watched him with growing rage. "I'm asking you, are you even okay?" Her voice, thick with exhaustion, was gaining intensity, swelling with hatred. "Get out of here and take your junkie friends with you." But instead of stopping, he climbed into a closet, shut the door behind him, and continued shaking the bottle inside. The scene made me uneasy. His sister stood watching the closed closet with us for another 5 minutes, then spat on the floor and stormed back to her room, as if this were just another ordinary occurrence in their home. I tried to block it out. A quick glance at Marderface showed something similar in his expression. After long preparations, we finally moved to the kitchen. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, but we were fixated, watching the speed cook on an overturned metal bowl. At that moment, I started feeling like my mere presence would somehow ruin everything. So, without drawing attention, I walked to the bathroom. There, staring into the mirror, my gaze was unfocused to fixed on nothing. Something vaguely resembling a human stood before the mirror, and this was only the beginning. The cook and the apartment owner finished dividing everything into syringes and went off to shoot up. We, however, drank 1.5 cubes each, took another 10 with us, and left without saying a word. By early morning, there was no point in going to Marderface yet. We planned to call him after 9, so we decided to head to the rehearsal apartment and start cleaning up. The street looked like it had survived the night. The emerging light made everything feel sickening, like watching a movie in a theater with the lights on. The world around us became washed out and unpleasantly glaring. In animated silence, we reached my house, stashed the speed in the fridge, and set off for the rehearsal apartment. At the entrance, a painted-over mirror greeted us. For a moment, fear made my legs buckle. The meaning of the past 24 hours rushed back into my head with renewed force. About was the mirror. Meanwhile, instead of cleaning, Marderface was drawing a heptagram on the wall, quietly humming something to himself. Picking up a guitar pick from the amp, I carefully scraped at the paint on the mirror. If yesterday the surface had seemed solid, impervious even to sharper objects, now it felt more like soft, greasy plasticine. As if, after being removed from Marderface's basement, the mirror had begun to thaw. I rolled the peeled-off material between my fingers and showed it to Marderface. "What do you think this is?" I asked, handing him a small ball. "Looks like plasticine." But it smells like coal. Maybe it's plasticine made from coal? If that even exists," he said, then quickly added, "Hey, let's try smoking it." That actually seemed like the first rational idea of the day. Before he even finished speaking, I grabbed the makeshift bong sitting behind the couch. The first attempts to light the ball were unsuccessful. It just turned a bit glossy, not even melting. So, we decided to mix it with tobacco and smoke it like oil. By the 5th hit, it started smoldering slightly, and a familiar, indescribable smoke mixed with the tobacco. A realization struck me. I had smelled like this before I was born, before I became human and entered this reality. By the 6th hit, the smoke remained strange, growing denser each time. Through the cloudy bottle, it looked grayish, then blue, then black. The 7th hit was pitch black. Marderface took it first. He just nodded in surprise and coughed occasionally. By the 8th hit, the ball had heated to an almost white-hot glow, burned through the foil, and started sizzling as it danced on the water before going out. "Whoa!" Marderface exclaimed, staggering. It was unclear whether he was amazed by the sensation or by the way it burned. "Do you feel anything?" I asked. Not real." His voice trailed off as he began slumping forward, moving as if he were floating in water. Then, spreading his arms as if he were lying on the surface of a pool, he murmured, "I don't know, man. I'm so fucked up right now, I can't even open my eyes. This must be what heroin feels like." He hovered there in the air. I had nothing to add. His last words sounded distant to me, like something I could never catch up with. A shiver of bliss ran through my body, making it feel as if I were being electrocuted by heroin. This kind of euphoria pulled me into sleep, and I once again found myself on the threshold of the dreamlike apartment. The dream once again made a victory lap around the living room, walked down the hallway, and opened the bathroom door only to break off and start over. It felt like it had been repeating in circles for the 1000th time, speeding up each time. After another 1,000 cycles, a voice quickly muttered something from the side, and then all the scenes flashed past like a sped-up slideshow within a second, over and over again. Then, I thought I was really waking up thinking about it, living through weeks, almost forgetting everything when the loop restarted once more. After all of this came a long darkness, during which I was falling until I finally woke up. Opening my eyes and looking around, I saw Marderface sitting by the mirror. He was diligently scraping off the black coating from the mirror and smearing it into an empty coffee can with a knife. From my sense of time in the dream, I had been asleep for a week, but in reality, only about 15 minutes had passed. In that time, Marderface had already cleared a small section the size of a soccer ball, and he could easily see his reflection in the uncovered part of the mirror. Taking a guitar pick, I started helping him, and together, we cleaned more efficiently. So before long, the coffee can was filled to the brim with the sticky substance. In the mirror's reflection, we looked strange whether because of the meth or the mirror's peculiar nature. We seemed distorted, alien. Looking at myself in the reflection, I realized I didn't remember ever looking like that. Marderface looked different. To all his facial features were in place, yet they seemed completely unfamiliar. And when I turned to look at him in real life, compared to his reflection, it was as if there were two entirely different people before me. The door reflected in the mirror behind me was also different. And it wasn't just the mirrored reversal, it was something deeper, something fundamentally altered in its appearance. "Let's cover it up. It was painted over for a reason," Marderface said, and started looking for some old rags. There was no point in talking about it, we had both seen it with our own eyes. Grabbing a blanket from the couch, we draped it over the mirror and plunged into cleaning, which took on a funeral-like atmosphere. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Marderface, too, seemed to be struggling with something similar. My thoughts spun into paranoia. Either that black coating we had smoked had affected us, or Manor Devore had set us up from the very beginning. Either way, he was involved, which meant we needed answers. "We have to figure this out, and we'd better not wait," I said, and we set off for Manor Devore's house. Repeating the same thoughts over and over, I kept slipping through time, noticing how the surroundings changed, bringing us closer to Manor Devore's home. Soon we reached the outskirts of the settlement, and after another mental lapse, we were already approaching his house. A technique for lucid dreaming popped into my head on, where you had to look at your hands and ask yourself, "Am I dreaming?" Everything that was happening made me do exactly that. Looking at my hands, I was struck by one terrifying detail. A couple of years ago, at the start of my farm occult life, I had performed a ritual that involved slitting my wrists. Being right-handed, I had cut my left forearm with my right hand. Because of that, my entire left forearm had been covered in small scars. What made me freeze in horror now was the fact that my left arm was completely clean, while my right one was covered in scars. I must have gone pale at that moment, it was hard to tell. The only thing I could do was blink, turn my head, and stare at my hands again. Marderface must have noticed my shocked expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. "My hands. Look." I showed him my forearms. "Remember how I had scars on my left hand? Now they're on my right. You see this, don't you?" He was silent, staring at my hands with a puzzled expression. His silence made everything even worse. Then, slowly, he began rolling up the right leg of his pants. "I had a big scar on my right knee," he murmured without looking down. "If it's not there now." He pulled up his pant leg, still not looking. I glanced at his knee. There was no scar. "Check your left leg," I said, staring in shock at the scar that had now appeared on his left knee. Marderface slowly lowered his head and stared at his leg for a long time. Then he started touching one knee, then the other. "But how is this possible?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "We've been played, big time. We fucked up," I said, trying to steady myself. Why would they do this? What does this accomplish? He asked. I don't know, but maybe Manadivore has some answers. And you really think we can trust anything he says after all this? Marderface looked at me doubtfully. He's the last person we should be dealing with right now. If he knows about our plans, if they all know, then we have nothing to hide. We'll ask him directly, and if it comes to it, we kill him, I said, trying to piece together a world that had changed forever. Even though we hadn't slept for a day, regularly taking all sorts of substances, hallucinations like these just don't happen. And the fact that it was real there was no doubt about that. We walked the rest of the way to Manapogiratiel's house in silence. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to grasp the situation and find a possible solution. As we reached the street where his house stood, we slowed down to a casual pace. Every now and then, shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, which I imagined as vultures from the beyond, already aware of our doom, simply circling above, waiting. After scouting the area around his house and making sure no one was nearby, we climbed over his fence. The dogs on chains started barking, straining against their leashes toward us. Their barking mixed with choking wheezes and the clinking of chains. We heard the front door creak open. Stepping onto the porch, Manapogiratiel looked around, spotting us and freezing in surprise. We were calling you, but you must not have heard us. Marderface started in a friendly tone. I was in the kitchen messing around, had the television on, Manapogiratiel said, lighting a cigarette. Come out. We found a buyer for the mirror. He wants to talk to you himself. It's yours after all, I said, making up a story on the spot. Manapogiratiel raised his eyebrows in surprise, eyes lighting up with excitement. How much is he offering? He wants to discuss it with you, maybe negotiate a bit. Marderface chimed in. All right, give me a sec, I'll get dressed, he said, stubbing out his cigarette. Marderface turned to me and whispered, We'll lure him to the apartment. Act natural until then. I nodded, and we started pacing around the yard. By then, the meth had fully kicked in, and it took all our willpower not to start sweeping the yard or doing some other obsessive task. Manapogiratiel came out 5 minutes later, dressed as if he were going to a birthday party. Getting a closer look at him, I kept wondering, when did he start obeying those who wanted to harm us? Had he been on their side from the beginning, or did he give in somewhere along the way, tempted by some trivial reward? Outwardly, he didn't give anything away, but we already knew who he served. The answers would come later. Right now, we just had to observe. When we finally reached our rehearsal apartment, Marderface and I exchanged glances. Manapogiratiel was walking slightly ahead, talking on the phone with some weed dealer. I gestured to Marderface, pointing at Manapogiratiel's head and miming a strike, then a grab. Marderface nodded. As we reached the apartment, the last few moments before opening the door were filled with Manapogiratiel's joke. Shay was telling something he found funny. The moment we stepped inside and locked the door, I struck him in the back of the head. He took 2 steps forward, crouching slightly, hands raised over his head. Why the hell isn't he going down? I yelled, hitting him again. Hit harder! Marderface shouted, grabbing Manapogiratiel's legs. I hit him in the head 4 more times, but he still didn't pass out. He just turned away, shielding his head with his hands. I've got him. Get the extension cords, we'll tie him up. Marderface grumbled, straining to hold down the struggling Manapogiratiel. I grabbed all the extension cords lying on the floor, along with a couple of guitar cables, and ran back to Marderface. I handed him a tangled bundle, and we set to work tying up Manapogiratiel. Now you're gonna pay for everything, you bastard, I hissed, savoring each word. You really thought we wouldn't catch on? Marderface sneered, tightening the knots. You're going to tell us everything, like it or not, I added. I'll go get the truth serum. Watch him? Marderface nodded quickly, focusing on securing Manapogiratiel. I rushed home, grabbing all the meth from the fridge, along with the bag of pills we'd taken from Manapogiratiel's place the night before. My rage had reached its peak. White flashes flickered in my vision. Black dots danced before my eyes, and I could taste rust in my mouth. I splashed cold water on my face, ran my hand through my hair and saw a bunch of strands fall out. Rinsing my hands, I ran my palm over my head again. More hair came loose, like I'd just been to a barber. No time to dwell on it. I gathered everything and ran back. As I neared the rehearsal apartment, muffled noises reached my ears like singing. The sound was punctuated by bursts of guitar playing. I opened the door to find Marderface strumming a guitar in front of Marderface, who was sobbing hysterically, still bound. His genuine tears enraged me, and without thinking, I kicked him hard in the stomach. He doubled over, whimpering. "You think we don't know everything?" I roared. "Please, let me go. Let me go," he stammered through sobs and gasping breaths. No, we haven't even started yet. "You're going to tell us everything," I said, pulling out a syringe filled with meth. I measured out 3 cubic centimeters. "There's no point in pretending anymore. You know you've been caught." "I don't understand," he stammered again. Instead of listening to his pathetic act, we pounced on him. Marderface pried open his mouth, shoving a screwdriver handle between his teeth, while I quickly squirted 3 cubic centimeters of meth inside. Then I clamped his mouth shut. He started coughing violently, mucus streaming from his nose. His body convulsed with spasms, and I watched his broken form, savoring the moment. In less than an hour, he'd start talking on his own. When he finally swallowed and stopped coughing, I removed my hand. He was clearly thinking fast, searching for a way out. But instead of continuing his crying act, he simply asked for water. After giving him a little to drink, we kept interrogating him, trying to find out how long they had known about us, how many of them there were, and what their next move would be. An hour passed, and Marderface had completely transformed. He was talking more than we were, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. From a pathetic, sobbing wreck, he had morphed into someone radiating warmth and friendliness. "Come on, guys, what are you doing? Let's take a little and stop. That's enough. Let's go for a walk somewhere. Why sit here? You guys are just freaking out a bit on the crank. Happens to everyone. Untie me. You know yourselves this is just paranoia. Who are they? What enemies? And me, of all people? You've known me for years, think about it," he said in a friendly tone. His words only made us tenser. He was trying to get inside our heads, playing on our sympathy, confusing us, and pretending more than ever. The way he spoke so convincingly only proved once again that we were right about him. All this time, we had been blind, ignoring the obvious, allowing ourselves to be deceived, but not today. He repeated the same speech over and over, adding new details, smiling. He threw in different remarks, politely paid us compliments, acted amazed at the absurdity of the situation, tried to draw conclusions, offered morals, and then started all over again. I was getting tired of his chatter, his pointless attempts to deceive and manipulate us. Not waiting for him to finish another one of his friendly monologues, I grabbed a random vial from the bag of drugs we had taken from his place. I pulled out an ampoule, snapped it open, drew the liquid into a syringe, pushed out the air, and, ignoring his continuous muttering, injected everything into his leg at once. For a few more moments, he kept talking out of inertia. Then his gaze shifted to the syringe sticking out of his leg. Suddenly, he panicked, frantically asking what I had just injected. It was obvious he was truly scared now. The friendliness and fake kindness instantly vanished from his face. Repeatedly stammering, "What did you inject? What does it say on the label?" He breathed heavily and tried not to look at the syringe. "Talk," I demanded in a calm but firm tone. "I don't know what to say. Please, enough. This is too much already. Don't you get it? You've gone too far. You could kill me," he gasped. "Talk, or I'll inject you with something else," said Marderface, pulling another vial from the bag. "You're screwed if you don't let me go right now. I'll file a police report. You guys are insane, you could actually kill me," Mana Devourer yelled, shaking his head. "Buddy, don't you get it yet?" I asked. "You're not leaving until you tell us everything." For a moment, anger flashed across his face, but then he went back to threatening us with the cops. We knew he was trying to bluff, and hesitation wasn't an option. Marderface swiftly plunged another syringe into his leg and emptied it completely. Mana Devourer screamed in horror, staring at one syringe, then the other. I'm burning up. Do you hear me? Untie me. I can't sit still. I feel sick. Give me water. Please, give me water," he begged. We gave him some water, but continued questioning him about what he knew. With every new question, he winced and groaned. I felt we were close to breaking him, but he still pretended to know nothing. Another syringe went in, then another. Soon, his legs were covered in a dozen syringes sticking out in all directions. He looked like an antenna receiving signals from beyond. When we ran out of ampoules, we started shoving pills into his mouth, which he tried to spit out. That's when we threatened to grind them into powder and inject him with that instead. Defeated, he swallowed everything we poured into his mouth. He looked like someone who had just been pulled out of icy water. His lips were turning purple, and his normally pale skin was taking on a bluish tint. A sickly yellow sweat oozed from his face. "Well, what luck. Looks like he's about to transform." "We need to grab our guitars," said Marderface, running to the corner of the room. "So, are you going to talk, or do you want more?" I demanded. For an hour, I repeated the same thing, occasionally hitting him in the head. The whole time, he groaned and thrashed his head from side to side. What had once been sweat was now a thick, slimy film dripping down his face. After yet another demand to speak, instead of answering, Mana Devourer vomited a long stream of black bile. Partially digested white pills shimmered like stars in the dark sludge. The substance was thick, more like swallowed dirt than vomit. Another convulsion. Then he puked again, this time onto his knees and chest. A horrible stench of earth and decay filled the room. "What the hell did you eat, dirt, you bastard?" The sight disgusted me and I couldn't hold back my rage. "Answer me, you piece of shit." He kept dry heaving, but nothing else came out, just deep guttural noises. Marderface looked at him and said, "We're gonna have to make him drink more crank." Hearing this, Mana Devourer screamed in terror. "Please no, I'll tell you everything. Just stop, please." Marderface and I exchanged satisfied glances. "I'll tell you everything," continued Manapojratel. "Yes, you're right. There is something happening to you, and there are those who are behind it. I can tell you everything. Just move the mirror in front of me, it'll be easier to explain that way." Grasping the mirror from both sides, we began moving it toward Manapojratel. "Take off the blanket, I'll show you everything now," he said in a detached tone. Pulling the blanket off the mirror, we stood behind Manapojratel and stared at our reflection. "Look," he said, and the mirror's surface was covered with a thin, barely perceptible ripple. What happened next is impossible to describe. The most fitting word for it wouldn't fully capture what occurred, but with all my effort, I could call it a manifestation. Something manifested from the reflection. It wasn't a hallucination or a vision. The shimmer replaced the reflection. The ripples that had just danced across the surface spread throughout the room. After a flash of light, depth appeared in the mirror's space. A noise came from within, along with gusts of cold wind. Without moving, I peered into the depths. Far in the distance, I saw a fire. Its flame was a barely discernible dot on the horizon, but unmistakable. As if obeying my thoughts, the distance, along with the fire, began to approach, slowly moving within the mirror. The fire grew closer, and as its heat became tangible, I winced slightly. Along with the approaching warmth, the brightness became unbearable. Everything was momentarily illuminated by a blinding light behind which voices could be heard. The brightness gradually settled, and I could make out what was happening again. Inside the mirror, I saw two people, a campfire and a tent. The view was from above, at an angle, like a cinematic shot. The two were talking animatedly, but I couldn't hear their words. A muffled groaning sound came from the tent, and the two ran toward it. They entered, and the tent began to shake. Unclear screams followed. Then a distorted infant's wail, except it wasn't a child, but an old man imitating a baby. The crying was broken, hoarse, and unnatural, making me uneasy. Suddenly, one figure tumbled out of the tent, stumbled, and started running into the forest. The tent continued trembling with sounds of struggle and shouting. What had started as crying turned into an aggressive noise, more like a pig's growl. One of the tent's walls collapsed, and a silhouette flew out, holding a small, dark, snarling mass of darkness. Meanwhile, another figure crawled out from under the fallen tent and remained motionless, watching. As the snarling creature nearly overpowered the first person, he hurled it into a pit that had appeared in the ground. While growls and digging sounds emanated from the pit, he frantically shoveled dirt over it. Smoke rose from the ground. The scene cut off, replaced by a different angle of the same location, but at another time. Now, the two were digging up the spot they had just hastily buried. Eventually, they pulled out a bottle filled with black liquid and began to leave. The scene changed again, now showing a dimly lit small room. Two wardrobes, a bed, chairs, and windows on either side. The same two figures, but now directly in the center. They approached the mirror, and even at close range, their faces remained blurred, impossible to discern. They gestured as if trying to show something, and then began smearing the mirror, coating it in thick black paint from the bottle. Gradually, they covered the entire visible space, finishing with the mirror turning completely black. The dark surface began to vibrate, and the vibrations formed words in my mind. "He is not your enemy, but the one who harbors the beast." More phrases followed, revealing that the situation was entirely different than we had believed. That the so-called opium god had nothing to do with it, and that those truly involved had simply manipulated our clouded minds, planting deeper and stronger doubts each time. That everything we had thought to be the truth was a deception, leading us towards something terrible. The manifestation continued speaking, revealing the true nature of what had happened. The information struck my mind like a surge of energy, leaving me frozen in place. For a few moments, I stared at the impenetrable darkness of the mirror's surface until I realized I was looking at my own reflection. What I had seen was terrifying and incredible, but something else horrified me even more. When the manifestation ended, we saw that the chair where Manipos Rachel had been tied up was empty. The extension cords and wires lay scattered on the floor, along with a pile of empty syringes. Just as we were about to search for him, it dawned on me that we would never find him, and that realization stopped me in my tracks. What had just happened forced us to think deeply, and we began discussing at length how to fix everything. So, we ended up behind the mirror, in the wrong reality, and that explains a lot, I said. Something else bothers me. If they sealed it from the other side, how do we get back? Asked Marderface. Indeed, from what we had seen, it was clear that the other side was closed off. Looking down at my hands, I could still see that my scars were on the wrong side, meaning we were not in our own reality. The manifestation had spoken of someone who planned to give birth to the beast. But who it was, we did not know. The only thing we knew for certain was that we had to sober up. Pouring out the remaining Venti, we paced around the apartment, The atmosphere was heavy with pain and grief. All the Venti we had consumed so far had no intention of letting go, but we needed to sleep it off. Marderface suggested going for a walk. Then, suddenly, he stopped and pulled a tooth from his mouth. Surprised, he scratched his head, and strands of hair fell out. "Looks like we're running out of time," he said, staring at his tooth. "We're dying here with every passing second, and we might not make it," I muttered. "Come on, let's get some air," said Marderface, and we stepped outside. It was a gloomy day. The sky was covered in thick, dark clouds, so dense that it was impossible to tell where the sun was. Looking around, I searched for obvious signs that this mirror world was somehow different from our own. The signs on the shops were written normally, not in reverse. But Marderface pointed out that in this world, its laws applied to us, so we simply couldn't perceive the difference, while an outside observer would see everything flipped. The familiar neighborhoods remained unchanged, though they carried a strange, indescribable sorrow. The buildings, though grimy and old-looking, were still just buildings. If you didn't focus too much on your surroundings, nothing seemed unusual. We walked slowly, looking around, and the whole time, I avoided looking at people. The moment I glanced at a random passerby, everything became clear. People were the key to this world's unreality. Within the fraction of a second it took to look at someone, their appearance would change it twice. Watching them was deeply unsettling, so I lowered my gaze and asked Marderface, "Do you think we exist here?" "Well, we exist as reflections. The problem is rather in where we don't exist," he said and continued. "We were there, and here we only existed as reflections. Now we are here instead of reflections, and like reflections in a single form, meaning we don't exist in our reality because it was projecting us rather than reflecting us. And as I see it, it's impossible to project from a reflection. And what happens if we stay too long without being projected? Who knows? Maybe everything will remain as it is now, or maybe it will disappear, just as everything disappears when it stops reflecting. Yes, but it disappears for the mirror, not for everything else. Well, that applies to what happens there. Marderface gestured to the side. How it works here, I can't say for sure. What if we die here? I asked, feeling fear creeping in at the mere thought. Maybe we'll die, and that'll be the end of it. Or maybe we'll just disappear like Manivore did, or wake up back there, he said, pointing to the side again. I wanted to believe we could return. Unnoticed, things had escalated so far from drugs that I felt sick and terrified. Sure, we had believed in pharmacoccultism before, but we had always left ourselves an escape route. We would often show off to each other, sometimes playing along, but not now. Now, for the first time, it was real, and there was nothing inspiring about it. The romanticization of pharmacoccultism worked only as a narrative, not in practice. There was nowhere to say, "Stop." That realization terrified me even more. Because yes, it was happening for real, and it was bringing absolutely no pleasure. We had been walking straight ahead for a long time and hadn't run into a single familiar face, so we decided to check a courtyard where our friends usually gathered. After searching every bench, we didn't find a single soul. Then we went to the courtyard near my house and sat down on a bench. We were too exhausted to talk, and I could feel the effects of the speed wearing off. Staring at the asphalt, I was drowning in frustration. Suddenly, Marderface started tapping my shoulder urgently. "Look," he said quickly. In the distance, sluggishly making his way toward us, was our friend Puzo. He was walking without a shirt and looked drunk. He had earned his nickname because of his enormous hairy belly, which had appeared when he was 12. Now, at 15, it looked like a pregnant woman's stomach. It was covered in hair and had a long streak running down its center from spilled beer. Puzo, swaying slightly, walked toward us. "He's the one carrying the beast," Marderface whispered. There was no doubt it was him. As he approached, he greeted us. His hands were cold and sticky to the touch. His eyes were vacant, darting around chaotically. It's definitely him, I thought, realizing we needed to perform the ritual on him. He stood with us for a while, without saying much, then left without a word, disappearing into his apartment building. We knew we had to perform the ritual on him, but we also realized we'd need time to prepare. That meant we would have to live here for a while, possibly days. But the biggest problem was that we didn't have time. We were falling apart. Marderface said he needed to go home and grab a tent, so we started heading toward his place. As we walked, I spat out a tooth and felt the others in my mouth loosening. We crossed the entire city center without encountering a single familiar face. Sometimes we saw the same people over and over, but more often, even they avoided us. When we reached Marderface's home, we went inside. He quickly grabbed a folded tent and pointed out something strange. None of his photographs were in the apartment. The ones that used to sit in the cabinet were gone. To avoid getting separated, we decided to stay in our rehearsal apartment until the ritual was complete. Once we got there, we collapsed into a dreamless sleep. When I woke up, Marderface looked at me and said, "Have you noticed? Here, you never feel hungry or thirsty at all." And for the first time, I noticed that indeed, I didn't want to eat or drink at all. "The same goes for sleep," he continued. I seemed to have slept, but I caught myself realizing that it wasn't sleep at all. It was like in a childhood game. I told myself, "I'm sleeping." And then after a while, I said, "I'm waking up." And in between, there was only darkness. A moment ago, I was ready to argue with him, but then I suddenly realized that he had perfectly described what had been happening to me. After talking a little more, we began planning the ritual. We needed something that connected Puzo across all planes of this world and was personally tied to him. After observing him for a while, we decided to steal his spirit level. The first step of the ritual took shape in this object. Initially, the idea was to drink the water from the level's vials, where air bubbles floated, but at the last moment, we decided instead to mix that water with the thick black substance scraped off the mirror. I took the horizontal vial, Marderface took the vertical, and we symbolically offered the diagonal to the fire, our only ally. The effect of this was strange in its own way, but through it, we locked Puzo into all the planes of this world, confidently sinking deeper into the void, knowing he wouldn't be able to escape. In a way, we made him invisible to this world, forcing the threads of his fate to float in the air-filled vials. This was just a small part of our careful preparation for the unveiling ritual. Over time, we lost all the hair on our bodies, and almost all our teeth. Pain shot through my entire body with every step, and the only thing that slightly dulled it was the black substance, which we had almost completely smoked away. On my initiative, during this long ritual, we created fake copies of ourselves and immediately buried them to cover our tracks and avoid interference from opposing forces. Each evening, before heading home, we would focus on his window in silence, directing our attention and destructive energy toward it, preventing his apartment from becoming a safe haven. These were small but necessary measures to keep Puzo from settling into his normal orbit and moving toward birthing that damned metaphysical child. We started spending more time with him, discreetly slipping one haloperidol tablet into his beer each day while he went to take a piss. Then came Cyberzone, and some psychiatric hospital medication wrapped in a tattered bundle from Marderface's stash. Puzo began rambling incoherently and lost all sense of caution. We knew we were close just a little more, and we could proceed with the ritual, but we had to hurry because we were running out of time. Everything was ready. Choosing one of our secret clearings outside the city, we invited him on a camping trip. His slurred speech and sluggish movements made it clear he was barely conscious as he followed us. What had once been a real world a month ago now slipped through my mirrored fingers. My countless attempts over the past week to convince myself I was real had turned into a parody of thought. I was simply speaking words to occupy my mind and avoid thinking about my decaying body. Perhaps my only solid argument for my existence was the fear of disappearing. But even that didn't make any of this feel justified. For years, I had imagined the path to the final threshold. I had envisioned incredible landscapes where ultimate reality existed beyond moral comprehension. With each year of psychonautic experiences, the supernatural had become more detailed in my mind. I had considered countless possibilities for crossing over, but never getting stuck in a mirror world. This realization struck me as some kind of cosmic ironino, no matter how much you strive for eternity. In the end, it's mundane, material reality that ensnares you. Over the past week of preparation, our bodies had completely deteriorated. No teeth, no hair, only pale, waxy skin. The same was true for our weight. Marderface looked like he weighed around 40 kilograms instead of his usual 75, just like me. Our bodies were dying, and they could fail at any moment. The journey to the ritual site was eerily quiet. The people are gone, I thought. Just a little more, and it'll all be over, I told Marderface, trying to reassure him. When we reached our clearing, we began setting up camp. Marderface drove stakes into the ground and assembled the tent frame while I gathered firewood. Then, using a folding shovel, I dug the small grave required for the ritual. Puzo, meanwhile, was rolling around senselessly in the grass, occasionally smacking his lips. We gave him the last of the black substance to consume, along with some barbiturates. The tent stood firmly in place. This meant we could begin. The first and most important thing was the fire. It had to be lit and burning for the entire ritual, no matter how long it took. Next, we used stolen white towels, the kind that people tie to doorknobs when a resident of the building has died. During our time in the mirror world, we had only managed to find 2. We tied one around Puzo's legs and the other around his arms. Inside the tent, Marderface had driven 2 stakes into the ground. We stretched Puzo's body between them, securing him by the hands so that he was suspended. Then, using the last of the black mirror substance, we smeared his closed eyelids to ensure he couldn't see. To make his body reject the beast within, we had stolen ribbons from fresh graves and a couple of old metal grave plaques. We cut the ribbons into small pieces and burned them on one of the plaques. In another, we mixed water with graveyard soil. Lighting the morning ribbons, I began to blow smoke into the belly, while Marderface made him drink in between. At first, he groaned and resisted, but after the second round, he could only moan unconsciously. With a charred piece of a temporary cross found in the cemetery dump, we took turns cauterizing his stomach, cursing what he carried inside. His belly pulsed, the tent reeked of burnt hair. The ritual was taking effect, and as proof, Belly began to howl, struggling to break free. The wretched spawn was giving him strength, and the primal urge to save his offspring started to take over. Only moments ago, the sun had been shining, but now darkness fell abruptly, bringing an unnatural July cold. A fierce wind howled, making the tent sway violently. The fire outside struggled to survive, pressed low against the earth. Tossing the last sticks into the flames, I returned inside only to stumble back in shock. Belly gritted his teeth in agony as his stomach split open, revealing grotesque, slick, pulsing pink insides. Deep within, a black shapeless mass lurked. Marderface put on welding gloves and carefully began extracting the beast's seed from Belly's depths. "Untie him," he ordered, his hands disappearing into the writhing cavity, pulling out the dark clump. I quickly cut the towels that bound Belly. The moment Marderface pulled out the grotesque thing, Belly sprang up and bolted from the tent. There was a crashing sound, branches snapping. He was running. "Let him go," Marderface hissed. "Right now. The most important thing is to handle this carefully, no sudden movements," he whispered. But as he spoke, the dark child spasmed violently and shot out of his hands. It vanished for a second, then reappeared behind Marderface, lunging for his throat. He dodged, knocking me down in the process. The tent collapsed over us. As I fell, my head slammed against something hard. Darkness. Feeling around blindly, my fingers found the knife I slashed at the fabric, tearing my way to the surface. I saw a silhouette. It looked familiar, almost human, moving smoothly but far too fast. Its motion made sense, and yet repelled something deep within me. It was Marderface. He was fighting the dark, writhing form, snarling like a beast, terrifying. I wanted to help, but my strength was leaving me. The last thing I saw was him hurling the dark child into the small grave and frantically covering it with dirt. The world went black. Outside the window, it was blindingly bright, too bright to make out anything but vague outlines. I began to realize this was a dream place, an apartment of memory, but I couldn't remember myself at all. Familiar scenes. Footsteps echo through the hall, first one way, then another. Then they approach a closed door by the window. A growing dread fills me. I know something terrible is about to happen. The door creaks open, revealing a perfectly ordinary bedroom. For a moment, my fears seem unfounded, but then the footsteps move deeper inside. I freeze in horror. On the floor, a grave. The steps approach it, kneel, and begin to dig with bare hands. The digging takes time. Harsh breathing. Beads of sweat fall into the dirt. Hands, buried to the elbows, find something, grip it and pull. A charred, blackened infant corpse emerges. Looking closer, I see a pig's snout, tiny budding horns breaking through its forehead, unnaturally twisted little fingers. Gripping its deformed, stunted wings, the figure carries it deeper into the apartment. Through the bathroom door, inside dear slaughterhouse. But instead of carcasses, the hooks hold grotesque, disfigured bodies, each one resembling the unearthed mutant child. A thought gnaws at me. I've seen this black monstrosity before, but where? The memory refuses to surface. For a moment, I am frozen in fear. Then I see him, the terrifying figure from my dream. His demonic, insane eyes stare straight at me, and then I see his head rises from a heap of severed limbs, floating in a bathtub full of blood. Holding my gaze a second longer, I finally take in the details. Small, flesh-colored horns, huge lower fangs jutting forward, grotesquely protruding jaw. The severed hands have long, razor-sharp claws. His feet end in hooves. A realization strikes this is a dead abomination. I look up into the mirror. A man in something like a gas mask, clad in strange protective gear, stares back. He turns his head slightly, and the rest of the room comes into view. Massive cauldrons bubbling over flames in the corner. Along the wall, a table piled high with the limbs of even more deformed, unnatural creatures. The figure drops the blackened infant into a cauldron and carefully stirs the dark brew, reaching for a vial of clear liquid. Then, a scoop of white powder. Pouring them in, the surface of the liquid breaks into glossy black bubbles. Stirring again. Now, the ladle meets no resistance. Lifting a spoonful of thick, uniform sludge, he nods. Turning off the fire, he retrieves a 3-liter glass jar and steadily fills it with the black, viscous substance. Then he moves again, returns to the grave room by the window, kneels, carefully buries the jar in the earth. For a moment, I see only soil. Then the room fades away. I opened my eyes. Marderface stood over the grave. "So, what now?" he asked. "I think I know," I said, and lunged toward the mound. Marderface stepped aside. I dug my hands into the fresh dirt, feeling warmth rising from below. My fingers reached deeper, drawn to the heat, until they closed around a hot glass jar. Shoving it into my backpack, we started back, moving fast. We walked, knowing exactly what had to be done. Back at the apartment, we retrieved the mirror. Then, straining with our last reserves of strength, we dragged it toward the house of the Manor Devourer. The mirror was impossibly heavy. Its weight felt like the burden of all reflected existence pressing down on me. Just a little more, just a bit further, I muttered under my breath. We walked and fell, crawled and rose again, bearing it upon our back. Halfway there, my skin started to peel, my shoulders blistering with radioactive sores. My body was beyond vomiting, only dry convulsions remained. Beneath us, the paths of the village stretched ahead. Following them, we reached the house of the Manor Devourer. The gate was open. No one home, not even the dogs. We entered and began forcing the mirror inside. As I slid one side through the doorway, I heard the old woman's laughter again, but this time, I held firm. With the last of our strength, we hauled it into the basement, squeezing it past the shelves. Then finally, we collapsed beside it. "Get up," said Marderface. "We can't stop. We have to make it in time." He pulled out a bottle with a black substance and opened the lid. Not understanding what was happening, barely standing on my feet, I reached into the jar and along with him began smearing the mirror. The universe trembled. A rumbling sound filled the air, and a strong wind roared above the house. A storm was approaching. The surface of the mirror was completely covered, and the house started shaking as if during an earthquake. "What now?" Marderface shouted over the deafening noise. I turned at his words and saw a sliver of light at an angle behind him. I remembered that there used to be just a door leaning against the wall, but now it looked slightly open, as if concealing a source of light that seeped through the crack. "There!" I shouted, and grabbing Marderface's hand, stepped into the blinding light. For a while, all I could see was that same dazzling light. Then, I opened my eyes. Looking around, I saw a bright day. Everything that had happened recently flashed before my eyes, and I was horrified. I quickly examined my hands. My scars were in their proper places. Then, I checked my teeth and simultaneously ran my hand through my hair. At that moment, Marderface walked by. "You're alive, you're okay, and your hair is intact. We did it!" I shouted with joy, unable to believe that it was all over. He looked at me in confusion and went to set up the kettle over the fire. I started telling him everything that had happened, but he only shrugged in surprise. It became clear that everything I had experienced had happened only to me. As I kept telling him about the events, I began to remember how we actually ended up here. We had truly been here for a week already. At first, Manavor and Puzo were with us. It was our usual summer camping trip. We had been getting incredibly high all week, and toward the end, Manavor got upset over some stupid joke, packed his things and left, asking us never to call him again. Left with just the three of us, we decided to celebrate the last days properly. The day before yesterday, we took mushrooms, mixed them with barbiturates, some herbal milk we brewed, and a rare terrine that Manavor had left behind. Puzo, known for his greed, was trying to get more pills and milk than anyone else. He kept sneaking extra sips and eventually lost his head. Marderface told me that yesterday Puzo poured oil on his shirt and tried to set it on fire, so Marderface had to take it away and bury it. After that, Puzo ran off into the woods and hadn't returned since. Meanwhile, I had been lying there for almost 2 days. My mind was in a complete haze, and I couldn't gather my thoughts. Just an hour ago, the trip with the mirror, the birth of the dark child, and death had felt so real. Now, they were just a collection of images. I tried to recall more details, but they vanished like a faded dream, losing all significance. I wanted to sober up, and after this, to quit everything for good. Marderface suggested that we rest by the fire for the evening, and head back to the city the next day. That night, I tried a few more times to tell him about my bad trip, but as I spoke, I realized it was nothing more than a dream. Marderface wasn't really interested either after all. He wasn't part of what had happened. Staring into the fire, I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, Marderface was already packing up the tent. I gathered my things, helped him with the gear, and we set off back to the city. At home, friends from the neighborhood shocked me with a story about Puzo. Apparently, he never told his parents he was going on a trip, and they had reported him missing. For the entire week we were out there, the police had been searching for him. In the end, when his trip finally wore off, he wandered out of the woods wearing only his underwear and roamed the town until someone noticed him. Someone called the police, and they detained him. After checking the missing person report, they returned him home. But even after all these days, he hadn't recovered. His mind was gone. He could only mumble and stare at the ground. A week after our return, I walked past his house and saw him outside, walking arm in arm with his mother. It was a disturbing sight. In the middle of July's heat, he was wearing a hat and a thick sweater, constantly mumbling something. I didn't know if he would ever return to normal. I greeted his mother, looked at him, and walked on. He had always been greedy, always wanted to talk for money, to be taken care of. That's why he came with us, and now he had gotten exactly what he was looking for. Maybe he was dreaming of something just like I had been. Maybe he was still in that dream, wandering and stuffing his huge belly. Or maybe in that dream he was finally happy and everything he wanted came true instantly. I turned once more and looked at them slowly walking together. His head was bobbing slightly, as if he were agreeing with all my thoughts. The days passed calmly. Marderface and I met up at our rehearsal apartment, wrote songs, rehearsed, but mostly just wasted time. Summer vacation was ending, and soon the last years of school awaited us. We didn't touch substances again. Pharma occultism, after the bad trip I had experienced, took on a new meaning for me, and I decided to be done with it forever. One of the last days of summer, we stopped by the market, and then paused in front of a huge, crudely written red inscription on the wall. The sleeper fights for his fate, but the awakened does not. I stared at it, lost in thought. Marderface also pondered for a moment and said, "I'm looking at this inscription, and I feel like I've seen it somewhere before. I realize I should probably try to remember where, but I just don't care." "Me neither," I said, and we walked on. Summer came to an end, and a pleasant chill filled the air. We walked, looked around, talked about familiar girls, and planned to take them to a cafe. The last years of school lay ahead, and then college. I looked toward the vast spaces of life and clearly saw myself there. Endless possibilities, and only good things in the future. 2 small clouds floated by in the sky above us. Unremarkable ones, the kind that usually vanish without a trace. The kind no one bothers to remember. I looked at them and decided to remember them forever.